publishing. To Art Often King.
Greg,
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It's lovely to have you here with us tonight.
Yes, it's the evening over there, right?
Yes, it's 8:01 p.m.
5 hours. Okay.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it makes me look like I'm in some sort of film noir movie, so it's cool.
So thanks for having me.
It's all right. It's all right. Now, what I was thinking of doing before we start is I thought it'd be interesting because I normally don't do this. Instead of kind of analyzing a text, which is what I normally do, I thought we could maybe just riff on some topics and see where the conversation goes. Is that okay with you?
Yes, that's fine.
Because I think we have a lot we want to talk to each other about anyway. And this might be an interesting way of doing it in front of the whole world.
Okay. Well, let's get started.
Okay. So I'm here with Dr., if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Rick Ripetti, who is a, what would you say, a professor of philosophy? We're talking about community college, or would there be some other title?
That's it.
Okay, you're professor of philosophy at, is it Kingsborough Community College in New York?
Yes, it's one of the many colleges in the City University of New York. It's in Brooklyn, by the way, which is as well known around the world as New York is.
I know. So you are primarily known, I think, as a Buddhism scholar who does stuff on Buddhism and free will. Would that be a correct summation?
Buddhism, meditation, free will. Those are the main things that I've been working on since I got my dissertation. Yeah.
And I'm guessing you've been working on these things for, at least since the 90s, right?
Well, I started grad school in the early 90s. Yeah.
Interesting.
But I've been practicing yoga and meditation for 40 something years.
Wow. So are those sort of the disciplines that brought you to philosophy and philosophical questions?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I would imagine just retroactively, how we rewrite our narratives. I don't know how accurate this is, extrapolating from my memory, but I do believe that I was philosophically inclined as a kid. So I remember in Catholic school questioning the nuns about some of these beliefs and whatnot. But apart from that, yeah, the thing that really pushed me in the direction of philosophy was my very first yoga class. At the end, we were in deep relaxation and I had an out-of-body experience, which blew my mind.
Wow.
Yeah, and I went out and got my hands on anything I could at the library. We didn't have internet back then, about yoga and meditation. And, in my reading, from the yoga, I realized, it's meditation is, that was what I was doing in the deep relaxation thing and whatever. So I taught myself a lot of yoga and meditation. Within a matter of months, I found meditation teachers. And I just threw myself into that for a few years in my teen years, mid to late teens, very serious yogic practice, meditation and yoga, and like purification, austerities, fasting, all that kind of stuff. And I had a lot of mystical experiences. So those, reading up on all of that and trying to understand it that kind of overlaps automatically with philosophy. And when I went to college, I fell in love with my first philosophy class and eventually wound up, just doing my dissertation on it. I just kept going in that direction. So my yoga and meditation experiences kind of put a trajectory there that led to my becoming a professional philosopher. Yeah. long-winded answer, but like there's a much longer version of that answer, but that's good enough for starters.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So when you say these experiences, these mystical experiences brought you to philosophy, were you operating under the assumption that these mystical experiences were in some way veridical, or were you thinking you were experiencing something like hallucinations you wanted to understand better philosophically?
Yeah, well, at the time, I certainly thought they were not only veridical, but the word like is gnosis, Gnosis.
Yes.
You know, this is a word I didn't know back then, but I remember believing that I was experiencing something like gnosis, like a kind of immediately self-validating truthfulness or deeper access to reality or something other than ordinary daily experiences. Now, once I got my training in philosophy and, you know, my training at the CUNY Graduate Center, where I got my PhD, was in a program in a department that was heavily analytic, critical, logical, empiricist, kind of, you know, philosophy of language, philosophy of logic, philosophy of science, all those things were like the main thing. Well, you get that kind of training and then you become extremely critical about any of your former beliefs that haven't been validated through those kinds of methods. Yeah. So like those experiences brought me to philosophy, and then philosophy made me retroactively be a little skeptical about whether or not they really were veridical, you know? So, and this has been a kind of really like a philosophical existential conflict for me, having both of those parts to myself, the logical analytic part and the guy who's had mystical experiences, trying to get those two parts of my brain to figure out a way of integrating all of that. It's something that I'm still working on. It's an ongoing uncertainty on my part. So I would consider myself a Gnostic when I was younger, not in the religious sense, but that there's something that I was experiencing that was real. You know, and then there's all these Asian philosophical models about non-duality and how that might be real and all, you know, whatever. But, you know, I've always been philosophically curious about those things. But like I said, originally, for those years of my life when I was really in the midst of all that, I was a serious yogi. I still practice, you know, all along. But after a few years of it as a teenager, I modulated it downward because it was just too much for me. But with the philosophical training now, I would say I'm sort of, what's the term that I use? Semi-Gnostic or semi-agnostic. They mean the same thing. Semi-agnostic. So I'm inclined to still believe that those experiences were veridical, but I have serious skeptical, you know, attitudes toward the epistemic status. Like how good is my knowledge, you know, especially since it's memories of 40 years ago or something like that, you know. How valid are your teenage memories, you know, 40 years later?
Yeah, well, philosophers have different ways of dealing with these problems in religion and ethics of, on the one hand, feeling like they've had something like a truthful experience, but on the other hand, not accepting the metaphysics that are normally used to explain that experience.
Right.
So the two common ways of dealing with it is to be a kind of anti-realist, where you would say something like, my experience wasn't veridical, but it has its own kind of truth built into it, even though it is a hallucination.
Did you hear that? Was that your end, on my end, or your end?
I think that was your end. That was
okay. Let me shut off the Bluetooth. Sorry, and my notifications. Yeah. So keep talking while I look for my notifications thing.
Okay, so one way of dealing with that is to be a kind of anti-realist and say, yes, it's a hallucination, but there's truth in the hallucination, and there's truth in the philosophy that led to it, even though it's not metaphysical truth, it's some other kind of truth. Maybe it's a poetic truth that the metaphysics is really describing. And then the second way you could look at it maybe is a quasi-realist way, which to say your experience was veridical, but what it was showing you was not anything metaphysical. It was showing you something about life that the experience was designed to show you, but it's been misdescribed when it's been described as metaphysical. So those are the two avenues I can see you going down if you wanted to harmonize the love and respect for the experience, and also some sort of metaphysics, which doesn't allow for anything spooky or supernatural.
Yeah, well, there's also a similar move, even just in science, you know, with this kind of instrumentalist attitude that, okay, you know, science is not in the business of metaphysics. It's in the business of predicting and explaining how all of our knowledge interrelates with itself, and, you know, retrodiction, and, you know, explaining the past, predicting the future, technology, all of that. But what the underlying metaphysics is a separate question. Like, you know, is it something at the quantum level? Is it string theory? Is it, are we in a simulation? You know, those are kind of, in a way, beyond the scope of science, right? Answering some of those questions, those kinds of questions. So that attitude that a lot of people who are scientists, they're doing lab work, experiments, this and that, they don't care about the metaphysics, right? They care about what works within the scientific method and all that kind of thing. So by analogy, the distinction that you just made, I've had that kind of attitude for many years as a way of coping. Like, okay, whatever the ultimate metaphysics are, who knows? I don't know if I'll ever have a better answer to any of those questions. So I do try to, for meaning, grab hold of, you know, the more humanistic side of things, like you were saying, the meaning, you know, whatever value I can draw, or meaning or significance, or how those things can kind of fit into a more coherent way of just, you know, pragmatically getting through the day.
Right.
Yeah, that's what, yeah, I mean, I do that, but I'm still puzzled by it, because not just mystical experiences, like, you know, I'm working on a book right now, the Rutledge Handbook on the Philosophy of Meditation.
Right.
We've got about 25 chapters from different contributors, including myself. And one of the issues that I just kind of, you know, mention in brief, because this is a complex issue, and I'm going to leave it out of that book until I write my next book, which is going to be a monograph, meaning me only as the author, on the same topic, because it just requires an awful lot of space, and I don't have the space to address it in my one little chapter in the book. I'm the editor of the book, so the one chapter that I'm writing is try to just kind of justify the idea, because this is new, that there is, can be, or should be a philosophy of meditation, right? Because philosophy, even though science and medicine and business and everybody else have kind of latched onto meditation in the last decade or so, the philosophers are always the last to, you know, chime in on anything until something's really well established in society. Then the philosophers, they're like Monday morning quarterbacks. Then they'll come in with their analyses, right? So it's about to happen. I'm happy to be one of the people spearheading that. But in my chapter, I can't really go into this, but I mention it, and something in a footnote about how I'm working on it in my other book in progress. And that's this distinction between mystical experiences that are and are not what you would consider paranormal.
Okay.
You know, so, and I've had both, right? And most of the people, I think, who are writing in this book, you know, I got a lot of leading people, they don't even really address the paranormal stuff. They'll just address experiences of non-duality and, you know, this kind of thing, where you feel at one with the universe, or you've got some kind of transcendent feeling, or you think that you've experienced the absence of a self, or whatever. These are kind of psychological or kind of meaning-based, you know, things that don't necessarily have implications, or at least not as strong implications, for the metaphysics. The non-duality experience has some possible implications for metaphysics, right? Like, metaphysically, am I a separate self? Do we really have you know, these boundaries that we normally think that we have, or are we completely interconnected with everything? These are some Buddhist ideas, right? That some of the primary insights of Buddhism are that everything is ephemeral, momentary, transient, impermanent, constantly changing, and therefore everything is kind of interdependent, right? Everything is in a causal network with everything else, and the boundaries between things are such that, given this massive causal interdependence and ephemeral nature, there's no metaphysical conditions under which something could be a genuine self or have a genuine identity if everything is interconnected, right? So those are some of the things that they can be naturalized, those kinds of insights, so to speak. They don't necessarily have supernaturalistic implications, which are metaphysically heavy implications, but paranormal experiences, and I put those in the category of mystical because they'll often happen in a meditative or altered state or something like that, like precognition or telepathy, or, you know, the kind of out-of-body experiences where somebody sees something, it's like remote viewing or something like that. Those things have direct and immediate metaphysical implications about our model of physical reality and our models of time and things like that, right? I mean, if you have a genuinely precognitive experience, of course, the critics will say there's no such thing, right? Like you have a dream that's massively complex and it comes true, and someone else had the same dream, right? Like the probability against that, it's like two different people with two completely different sets of random lottery numbers hit the lottery 1,000 times in a row each, and both accidentally got the same numbers, right? Like statistical probability, like that's just wildly implausible. And that's the normal, I know I'm going on and on, but that's the normal explanation that critical science minded folks will give for precognitive experiences, like, oh, well, you know, millions of people are constantly having ideas, whether dreaming or awake, about the future. And it's like shuffling cards. The probability predicts that there are going to be some hits. If you're not counting all the misses, you know, you're really getting a skewed vision of what the probability really is, right? And nobody's keeping a record of these things. But I think that some of those things are not rationally dismissible on the grounds of probability predictions. And I've had those experiences. So those things really puzzle me. And it's hard for me to just go, oh, well, you know, I can have these happy ways of that, thinking about non-duality experiences and things like that. Because what the hell is going on in the world if you could have a precognitive experience of something on that level of complexity and someone else had the same experience and it's verified a year later or something like that, right? I've had those kinds of bizarre experiences, and it's kind of like being inoculated against the opposite view. Like it's hard for me to just say, well, yeah, you know, none of those experiences really challenge my metaphysics, because they do.
Okay.
So I'm sorry if I went on and on and on, but there was a lot there that I wanted to just give you a right up front. There's a big distinction between the paranormal mystical experiences, which to me, I can't just write them off,
right,
and the other kind of non-paranormal mystical experiences, which are, you know, wonderful, enlightening, freeing, liberating, meaningful, and all that kind of, but they're all naturalistic.
This is very interesting because in a way, this sort of deals with a lot of the material that my mentor, Robert Gray Cavan, was writing when I was an undergraduate. He was doing stuff, and I believe still is doing stuff, on the resurrection of Christ. And a lot of what his work deals with is probability. And he has a lot of interesting arguments about these kind of experiences that appear miraculous. Like they're sort of verifying that some alternate metaphysics is the case compared to what science tells us. And what he kind of says, I think, I don't want to be taking his stuff out of context, so he can come back on the podcast and correct me if I'm wrong about saying this.
Oh, you're still in contact with that? That's nice.
The general point that he's making, which might be relevant to you, is he says it doesn't particularly matter if any particular explanation of a miraculous event, which is naturalistic, fails compared to the explanation that the naturalistic event is somehow, sorry, the supernaturalistic event is somehow veridical. So it doesn't matter if you predict the future, let's say, and I give you a bad naturalistic explanation of how that worked. And it turns out that your, I really did predict the future explanation is better. What he's going to say is, we know a priori that whatever explanation is the best one, it has to be naturalistic, because all science does is, by implication, given us evidence against anything that would appear in that kind of supernatural experience to tell you the world is a certain way. So what he's going to say is something like, if the world were the way that it appears in supernatural experiences, we would be verifying that over and over again in science. But what actually science does is verify over and over again that however the world is, it must be naturalistic. We don't know what kind of naturalism, but we know that whatever the explanation is for you being able to predict the future, it can't be that time works in the way that it appears to work in your experience. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I'm totally aware of this. This is a kind of bias, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with biases that work. You know, we have evolved to have lots of really functionally effective biases in favor of the way that we process all sorts of things. But here's what I think is the negative part of the bias. The way that I would put it is, and maybe you really already addressed it in the way that you said, maybe the last sentence or so of what you said, which is, we don't know how naturalism works, but it would have to be naturalism. So, but then you did say, well, it has to be that our conception of the way time works is correct. But I'm not so sure that like an alternative model about how time might work under certain conditions is necessarily a non-naturalistic model, right? So it's a kind of, it's almost like assuming, like we did, that you know, Aristotle's teleological model of the universe was correct until we realized that it wasn't. And then we got a mechanical model from Galileo and Newton and all of those, right? Mm-hmm. Both of them were naturalistic models, right? It's just like acorns try to become oak trees or whatever, and like everything in the universe was teleological, but no, it's not. Okay, both, you could imagine that both of those are naturalistic models, right? So similarly, maybe there are ways in which, under rare or certain kinds of circumstances, maybe that there are other physicalistic processes at work that occasionally, and maybe they're rare, but occasionally under the right conditions, enable certain things like that to happen, but they're not supernatural, right? So I'd say paranormal, I didn't say supernatural, because this is an issue that I'm aware of. Like, let's imagine that some of the theories and, you know, some of the competing conceptions in theoretical physics about time, they're naturalistic, but they say that, well, if time is a dimension, right? We've got 3 physical dimensions and then a dimension of time, and there might be a 10-dimensional model. So from the 5th dimension above the time dimension, it might be feasible for, under certain conditions, somehow or another, to access more than one time. Right? That's a physicalistic model, not necessarily a supernatural. Like, if none of those other dimensions are supernatural and ghostly, right? They just function in ways that we don't know, right? It's kind of like, you know, Newtonian physics and then quantum physics, you know, relativity theory. The shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. That's if space is Euclidean, right? But space is not Euclidean, right? And both models, the Riemannian model and the Euclidean model, right? That space is curved in the newer model, right? So that the shortest distance between 2 points is more of an arc than it is a straight line, right? But that was considered just a logical axiom in Euclidean geometry, right? But both models are naturalistic, right? It's not that this is a spooky model of space that's supernatural, right? It's just, but it's still naturalistic, right? So similarly, maybe there are tachyons, subatomic particles that travel faster than light, and so they're moving in both directions at the same time, right? And maybe, you know, information can go, and maybe, you know, maybe our brains are extremely advanced in ways that we don't know yet how they work. So maybe there's some way in which minds can pick up, or brains can pick up information that reverberate backward and forward in time. I don't know, but like, I don't think that necessarily, I could think of a whole bunch of other models. I'll mention another one called panpsychism, which, like string theory, its critics will say it's speculative and it's not empirical because you can't imagine any conditions under which you could falsify it, right? That's the falsifiability criterion for the cognitive meaningfulness of any kind of empirical or scientific theory. But we can't imagine the conditions under which we could prove or falsify either of string theory or panpsychism. And panpsychism is the view that all matter, not just biological matter, not just things with neurons, has something that it's like to be it, and some kind of rudimentary mindedness, right, or consciousness. Anything that's capable of causal interaction, right, it might experience that impact on some level, but it's so rudimentary, right, but pan means all in psychism, so like everything has mindedness, but on a most rudimentary level. But evolved physical beings with neurons and brains, of course, have a very heightened self-referencing kind of consciousness, right? But what if panpsychism is true? It's considered pseudoscience by its critics because it's unfalsifiable. As of now, we can't imagine ways to falsify it, but inconceivable and impossible are two different things, right? So this is just some of the theories that I entertain to try to figure out how what I've experienced might be rational. If panpsychism is true, then if everything is minded, then there might be a way in which, in the same way that every particle in the universe is in gravitational communication with every other particle in the universe forms a network that's minded, even if the whole thing is not conscious at all, but every little component, like an atom might be, which could allow for the transfer of information across space and time. You've got now also physics. Einstein thought it was crazy. He called it spooky causation, action at a distance, or triple AD, as my physics teacher used to call it, action at a distance, right? Which is, what is that called? Non-locality or quantum entanglement.
Yes.
So particles that may have been entangled at any point can be, light years apart in theory, but they've done experiments to show this. What they're on the other side of the Earth, right? They've got you impact one of them, and both of them react as if they've been impacted, right? And they are not in physical contact, but there must be some medium, right? Well, that's one possible explanation. But so the point is, when you entertain all of these different things that are going on in theoretical and experimental physics, right? There are a lot of them are spooky seeming, but none of them are taken by their advocates to be non-naturalistic, right? So that's the kind of direction that I would go in to answer your mentor and say, naturalism doesn't necessarily rule out that precognitive experiences could be veridical.
So what would you say? What would you say to this objection? It's not naturalism versus non-naturalism, which is what's at issue here. It's the fact that you and mainstream science both have competing naturalistic theories. And the naturalistic theory that's accepted at the moment implies that your theory is false. So for your naturalistic theory to be true, you have to show something other than experience to show that it bests its competitors. What would you say to that objection?
Yeah, I think that's a valid objection. The way that I would put it myself to make a steel man of that view is that as the person who's had these experiences, right, I have to acknowledge that the evidential or epistemic value of my experiences is extremely small relative to the mountain of evidence, like you said, for the alternative theories. And what does mine count as? Testimonial evidence for anyone other than myself. And for me, the evidence counts as memory evidence. 40-something-year-old memory evidence. Well, some of the memories, I've still had some of these experiences throughout my life, but not as many as I used to have when I was younger. So yeah, the burden of proof is certainly on me, right? If I'm trying to persuade anyone else of the rationality of my views. But given not only the complexity of those experiences that I just sketched, in the abstract, and when we began this part of the discussion, in terms of hitting the lottery 1,000 times in a row and someone else hitting the exact same numbers 1,000 times over the same precognitive experience. That's one thing. Like probability favors my experience being veridical, in my opinion. I'm not a probability expert, but I think it's a reasonable view. But B, I've had so many of those experiences when I was a very serious practitioner of meditation and those other disciplines. I believe that being in those altered states on a regular basis did something that made me able to have those experiences, A. B, and I know this is kind of collective anecdotal evidence or collective testimony, there are traditions in Asian philosophy and also in Western theological traditions, but more explicit in the Asian ones, like in the yoga system, what is it called? The Yoga Sutras, written by the sage Patanjali about 2,000 or so years ago. He, but not only him, but almost every other school of Indian philosophy from that period claims that serious attainments in meditation typically have those consequences, right? So there is at least a monastic record and a philosophical framework in which, these ideas are not taken to be ludicrous, but like I said, that's just a kind of collective version. The mere fact that lots of people believe in miracles doesn't mean that they're really miracles, right? So I'm like, this is why I say I struggle with this, because I know that the burden of proof is on me, A. B, my theoretical account of these things is very minimalistic and sketchy and initial, and I'm in a Sisyphus kind of place, trying to push something uphill that I know no matter what I put up there, this combination will always knock it down. And it's a 1-2 punch thing between Occam's razor and error theories. So Occam's razor is the principle from William of Occam that you should always favor the theory. Whenever two theories would both equally well explain the same data, the more reasonable theory from a scientific point of view is the one that makes the least metaphysical commitments, or the one that asserts or implies the fewest amount of metaphysical entity types, right? And then error theories are any theory that would give a naturalistic explanation for some phenomenon such that the perceived explanation of it by those who have it, like seeing a miracle or having a deja vu or whatever it is, right? They think that it's something mystical or deep or paranormal or supernatural, right? But if you can come up with a naturalistic account of how someone could have that experience and erroneously form those wrong views, right? Then that's an error theory. And for almost anything I could ever say about the things that I've experienced, I myself can imagine error theories for them. So put that error theory on the scale with Occam's razor and I lose. I know that.
we should distinguish between error theory and anti-realism here, because where error theory would say that your perception is in some way an error, anti-realism would say your perception doesn't tell you what you think it told you, at least metaphysically, but there is some truth in it.
Right. Well, the error is in my interpretation. So you're right about that. It's not that I didn't experience that, or phenomenologically, right? My account of what I experienced might be veridical, but my interpretation of its source, cause, and metaphysical significance, that's where the error lies. So when people have deja vu experiences, they, from a scientific point of view, they make an error in interpreting them as being mystically significant in some way, shape, or form, right? And what's a deja vu? You have a sense, like suppose right now, as I'm saying what I'm saying, that that's exactly what I was going to say. And it's like a memory. You've got this powerfully lucid kind of mental state attached to it, this recognition. It's like a eureka thing. How did I know that? I couldn't have known it. We never had this conversation before, right? That's this feeling of deja vu, right? I mean, it's seen before, literally, right? But from a scientific point of view, it's very easy to come up with an error theory about that. the wiring for long-term and short-term memory is very intricately interrelated, and you had a kind of brain leak where as the information was coming in, it triggered sensations that are normally only triggered by long-term memory, right? So it's kind of like a leak, cross-wired, right? Brains can do that. We do it all the time, right? We make cognitive errors, right? So is that a physically possible thing? Yes, right? Is it neurologically feasible and plausible? Yes, right? So now you've got a naturalistic error account of how that interpretation that you have might have occurred in your mind, through mechanisms that undercut the interpretation that you brought to it, which is for some people outlandish views about reincarnation, me and my doppelgangers, paths just overlapped. People have all kinds of bizarro explanations for deja vu. Put those on the scale, the Occam's razor scale. If you got an error theory for it, no contest. Your deja vu goes down. Yes, it's meaningful, but what does it mean?
You know what's fascinating about this? It seems like you're vacillating between two positions, and that's causing you some existential strife, maybe. The first position is the error theory, and the first position is error theory. The second theory is a kind of realism about your experiences. But what's fascinating to me is you don't seem drawn at all to the anti-realist position in the middle, which is there is a kind of truth about it, but it's not metaphysical.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the place where I normally sort of rest, right? Like that's at least, it's like a methadone for my heroin, I dwell in that place where I just say, well, I don't care about the metaphysics, but really I do care about them. That's why it's problematic for me, because I'm inclined to believe the things that my really good philosophical training says aren't well founded in rationality, So,
Yeah.
but part of me says, no, like I can't be wrong about that. That stuff is just so intensely real.
Well, do you know what this reminds me of, actually? This is why I think most people who are religious are either religious or not religious, but they're not sort of religious anti-realists. It's very rare that you find a Christian that says, I don't believe Jesus really rose from the dead. I don't believe there really is God, but there's some truth to these stories. You occasionally find them, but generally religion spreads on realism. It doesn't spread on anti-realism.
Yeah.
And what's more likely to spread is not anti-realist Christianity, but actually non-belief if you tell people Jesus didn't rise from the dead.
Right. I think that anti-realism about religious claims or realism about religious claims, both of those are much more powerful and likely to be adopted than this kind of mediocre kind
You
of
mean error theory about religious claims and realism?
Yeah.
And the anti-realism is the one that's not likely to be adopted because it's too.
Yeah, like atheism, like atheism is easy to like buy into, and so is theism, but agnosticism is not as popular.
That's fascinating because I am an agnostic.
Yeah, I'm a semi-agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm agnostic philosophically, so I have a divided soul, as Plato would say. My rational mind is agnostic, but my emotional and spiritual side and my experiential personality and all that kind of stuff is leaning in the Gnostic side.
That's interesting. I can certainly understand that if you've had those kinds of experiences. I suppose it myself, I'm an agnostic because I don't know whether there is a God or there isn't a God. When you get into very specific claims about God and miracles, I tend to find the arguments for those claims somewhat bad most of the time. Although that doesn't mean the claims are false, because there could be some other good arguments no one's ever come up with yet. So who knows? But I suppose for me, God and the supernatural doesn't really solve any deep existential needs or questions I have. It just creates more possibilities for strange, bizarre, surreal forms of torture and paradoxes. So it's more comforting to just think there's nothing out there except us.
Yeah, I agree. It is comforting in a way. I think that culturally, I mean, it's hard to make generalizations because, like, just think about the culture in the UK, the culture in the rest of Europe versus the culture in America or in the United States, where you've got a lot more theists than atheists or agnostics,
Yeah.
right? Plus, but like, I think like people who go to church in the UK, I think they're in that middle position, right? Like, oh, this kind of meaningful stuff. And, they for hundreds of years, they've had that attitude, right? Like, it's good to have traditions and rituals and, around weddings and funerals and whatever, morals and all that. But, the supernatural stuff.
Well, the attitude here is, which I don't remember finding in the US so much, the attitude here is you can be religious and we'll consider you part of the good society. We'll consider you a socially respectable institution as long as you don't fuck anything up.
Yeah, it's a kind of tolerant posture.
Whereas in the States, I remember it was, you can be good as long as you don't disagree with anything that's mainstream religion. Then you're controversial. Whereas
Right.
over here, the constraint is put on the religion to sort of have the burden of proof to show that it's social. Whereas in the US, you have the burden of proof to show that you're social if you're not religious, is from what I remember. Do you think it's still like that?
Well, I mean, not in urban areas like New York City, but probably in the bulk of the country. Yeah, in the Bible Belt, certainly. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird if you find yourself in one of those cities or towns or whatever, where for whatever reason you're at a conference or whatever, and you're not in the philosophy place anymore, but you're outside of the venue and you get have conversations with people, in a coffee shop or something, and they speak in a way that presupposes that religious metaphysics as if it's consensually taken for granted as unproblematic, right? And you're not used to that kind of talk in New York City, but in other parts of the country, that's, that's the norm. It's still like that.
Yeah, I grew up next
Big cities like Phoenix,
You're absolutely right. I grew up in Los Angeles, which you would think is one of the more secular places in the US, but I grew up next to a university called Biola University, which was basically training people to be evangelical Christians. So most of the people I knew, were either kind of lukewarm Christians who were kind of almost Christian to be seen as social, or there were people who didn't believe in the dinosaurs and thought homosexuality was evil. And it always angered me that people who had what I thought were quite extreme views saw themselves as holding the moral high ground. Like it was your job to prove that you were social rather than their job to prove that they were social, given how extreme they were.
Yeah.
And whenever I see people with extreme views today act like the burden of proof is on you, I always feel something isn't right here.
Yeah. And that's becoming a phenomenon that, as you and I have talked about before, is really, really overly reified and polarized in the political arena. I was so happy to see you debating Yaron Brook recently, because he's very much on one side, and you're capable of having a conversation with somebody like him where, I don't know how to say this the right way. You weren't polarized. You weren't, you were capable of occupying positions on both sides of the spectrum, where I view him as almost entirely on one side of it. So I don't know if that's a fair characterization, but as you know from debating with people like him, you and I have seen each other debating people in social media about these things. Even in the political arena, it's almost like you're in some Bible Belt town on Sunday, and everybody's treating you like, you're a werewolf or something. if you have different views. But this happens on both sides of the political spectrum. And if you're somebody like either of us who have views that kind of span the political spectrum, then we're getting into it all the time with people on both sides.
Yeah. Well, funny thing about the Yaron Brook debate is I wanted to have him on my podcast because although he's too extreme for me on a lot of questions, he does say a lot of important, insightful things about inequality.
Right.
That I wanted to interview him about because I agree with those things he says. So I'm kind of a fanboy. So they asked me, do you want to debate Yaron Brook? And I was like, well, I just wanted to have him on my podcast. But I mean, so they were like, well, let's go through a list of issues and let's see what you disagree on. Do you disagree about free speech? No. Do you disagree with about identity politics? No. Do you disagree about cancel culture? No. Do you disagree about government regulation? For the most part, no. Welfare state, yes. So we did that one. But if you look at like the YouTube comments on my debate with him, nobody accepts that I'm not a leftist. They say I'm a socialist. And even when I've gone on YouTube and I've said, no, I'm not, I normally debate with leftists. They don't believe me. They think you must be a socialist.
This is like the church in Tennessee on Sunday. That's just, I guess those are those people who normally follow Yaron Brook, right? It's almost like, I hate to say it because I have a lot of friends who are Randians and I'm very sympathetic to Rand, and he's the head of the Rand, whatever that's called, Ayn Rand Institute, ARI, right?
Yeah.
They're frequently characterized as a cult. There's something accurate about that kind of description, but something inaccurate about it. I mean, a cult is a shared system of belief on one interpretation. So that's a more neutral use of the term. But then like most people who accuse the Randians of being a cult use it in the stronger sense, like Jim Jones cult or something like that, Yeah. But most of the followers of Yaron Brook are Randians. And they're deeply steeped into the Randian view. And from that perspective, anybody who believes in a social safety net or anything like that is a communist or a socialist.
There's nothing in between. You don't want a welfare state or you're, one of us, but nothing in between.
Yeah, one of my very good friends and my podcast host, it's his podcast, but I've been on it so many times that he made me a co-host with him, is Mark Gleason. What's the name of it? Level to Power.
Yeah.
What do you call it? He brought me into the world of Ayn Rand. As a philosopher, if you get a philosophical education, in the United States, when I got mine, if Ayn Rand ever comes up, she comes up as a stalking horse for a silly position that's easily ridiculed, her ethical egoism, right? And that's about it. And almost no professional philosophers take her seriously, right? But Mark is a really smart guy, and I got into many discussions with him when we became friends about this issue. And he persuaded me to go back and reread her stuff and whatever. And then I realized she's a brilliant system builder. She has a really coherent system, and most philosophers are not system builders. So those are the big people like Aristotle or Plato or Leibniz or whatever, Wittgenstein, or people who have a kind of comprehensive philosophy, not just this or that. Most philosophers are just critics of other philosophers. They're not luminaries, are the ones who build systems that could really work or provide meaning for lots of people. So I got persuaded and really found a lot of interesting and useful, philosophical content in Rand's philosophy, even though I don't agree with everything. My attitude always as a philosopher and a spiritual seeker is like a bee. I take a little pollen from whatever flowers I can and I make my own knowledge, my own honey. So I never wind up calling myself a blankist of any kind, like a Buddhist or whatever. I'm very impressed with lots of things about Buddhism. I'm a Buddhist scholar, but I'm not a Buddhist, although I incline in the direction of a lot of the stuff the Buddhists do, but also the stuff the Randian. I'm not a Randian, but I'm almost as much of a Randian as I am a Buddhist, because I like a lot of the stuff that I have but let me just finish the point. I see you want to say something. When he brought me into this, as his friend, I started checking out debates he was having with people on Twitter and everything. And I came in trying to help, advocate and support, because to me, Rand is an underdog in the world of philosophy, and I have a natural instinct to protect underdogs from bullies. And so I'd come in and try and, reason. But what happened to me, which really shocked me, is that the Randians didn't think I was enough of a Randian. So I wound up arguing with them, right? Because they view you as a socialist, right? So the same kind of thing happened to me with them. And I was like, okay, well, I still do what I can. I don't care. It's not about being on a side. It's about what arguments make sense, So I'm sorry I stopped you from.
No, it's fine. Actually, I was going to say, I don't agree with Rand's politics because they strike me as too collectivist. It's like a collectivist kind of capitalism, whereas I would prefer a more individualist kind of capitalism. But her ethics, her ethical
more about that? Could you say more about that? That's interesting to me.
Well, it seems
Rand the collectivist?
I think she is a collectivist, actually, because everything is about sacrificing for the greater good. It's not the greater good that liberals would countenance as the greater good, but what you're sacrificing is counterfactual safety on behalf of the collective not having to give up anything that it's earned in the market, on her view, I think. And that's a collectivist view, because it's the individual that has to sacrifice the counterfactual safety on behalf of everyone not having to pay any money for that counterfactual safety.
That's really interesting.
So it's basically, it's similar to Rawls. So you know how Rawls says, if you go into a society, it's just if counterfactually you're at the bottom, that there's some safety nets or some laws there to protect you or make sure that something from the top gets distributed back down to you. And I think what Randians say is that is a benefit of the individual that comes at the expense of the collective. So in order to create a situation in which that you have a safety net if you're in a bad position as an individual, the collective has to sacrifice some of its hard-earned money, which is unjust. So the collective takes priority over the individual on Rand, I think.
Well, I'm not sure I follow that. So Rand seems to be more worried about individuals being taxed to help other individuals, right? So
that's how she describes it. Yes.
Yeah, and so it's the individuals and their rights not to be exploited for the sake of others. This redistributive justice. How is that not an individual? I don't understand how you spin that as a collectivist thing. Try that again.
Okay. So. Well, you may disagree with it, and it's fine.
No, I'm not sure I understand it.
Okay, so the idea is one of the liberties that you have as an individual is counterfactual liberty. So that if your house burns down in a fire, there'll be a fireman. That if you get raped, there'll be a policeman. That if you can't get a job because there are no jobs around you, there'll be a welfare state temporarily until you can find a job. So those are all counterfactual liberties that you have. In the event things go badly, you can rely on these things as opposed to having to make decisions where you don't have those liberties and have fewer choices. The way that I interpret Rand is what she's saying is that those individual liberties, the liberty to have all of those different safety options in bad situations, is less important than everyone having the right to keep all their money and treat property rights as categorical.
Yeah,
that's
but that's not a collectivist thing. Just because it's everybody, it's not that everybody is a unit. It's everybody's just an aggregate of individuals with rights that shouldn't be violated.
But you could spin it the other way. Everyone is an aggregate of individuals who has rights to have options in the event of bad things happening to them.
Right. I see what you're doing. Yeah, that's interesting.
So the reason I would say it's collectivist rather than individualist is because it seems to me that the sacrifice that the collective makes in terms of spending taxes, not just on the welfare state, but the fire department, the police department, and everything else, is so that the individual can experience the benefits of civilization. the benefits of civilization, as far as I can see, are kinds of liberties. So for me, the police officer and the fire department man and the person who gives you welfare, they're not simply protecting you, they're creating options for you in terms of what you can do. There might be options other people don't like, let's say because people don't want you to be on welfare so you can write your philosophy book while they have to go, hunt for work to do what they want to do. But that welfare, whether they like it or not, is a kind of liberty. It's giving you a choice to write your book in a certain way that you wouldn't have if you didn't have any welfare in that scenario. So I see the protections that society pays for in the form of taxation as actually better described as liberties, because what the protections do is they create options for you that weren't there otherwise. And if you didn't have the welfare state and the fire department and the police department, what would you have? Well, you'd be living on an island. And there's a sense in which when you live on an island without a state, you do have agency, maybe more agency than somebody in a society, but you don't have the freedoms of a society because you don't have the options that a society gives you. But those options are only there because everyone makes a little bit of a collective sacrifice. So that's how the argument works.
Yeah, I'm not like seriously averse to the idea of some kind of minimal floor beneath which nobody should be let fall. I thought of myself as a Rawlsian for many years. I thought that his thought experiment was brilliant. And it, in fact, changed my thinking when I was a student, when I got exposed to it, from being purely meritocratic to thinking that, well, no, his model makes more sense in terms of just bias in the procedural justice sense of his thought experiment. If you don't know who you are, then you have to vote in a fair way on the principles that are going to structure your society. And if you vote a certain way and then come out of the voting booth into the society that you just voted for, but you don't know who you're going to be, then it's rational to pick the kinds of principles that you're advocating, right? So I've been, very, very much in favor of that most of my life, until it was really foisted upon me by Ayn Rand that, well, there's negative rights and positive rights. And this kind of conception that you're talking about, that, yes, the system gives you all these affordances, which enhance the ambit of everybody's liberty in a sense, but restrict everybody's liberty in another sense. Not everybody, but it's not even, it's kind of on the averages or whatever. I don't think it's unreasonable at all to do that in a society. But it's about just what's philosophically, morally justified. That's like, especially the way that you described it. It's pretty reasonable to think about it the way you said. Counterfactual liberties. One of the terms that we use in the last decade or so in philosophy is affordances, right? Yeah, things are possible for you now that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. But the libertarian, and I'm not sure that you're a libertarian, but the libertarian view, but it's hard to say the libertarian view because that's like herding cats, in terms of, you got all different kinds of anarchists and everything else.
Like, what is a conservative?
Yeah, but like a standard libertarian position against this line of thinking is just to emphasize the distinction between positive and negative rights, and to insist that it's no one else's right to make those kinds of decisions about how much of a percentage of my life I should have to give up in taxation. So if I work 40 years and I'm taxed at a 25% rate, then 10 years of my life I devoted to the society. That's a lot. Nozick's book, I have, one of the problems for me is, like, you saw it already with the mystical stuff, right? It's hard for me to really finalize my thinking about anything, especially when there are reasonably good arguments on both sides, right?
I understand how you feel.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel the force of that argument too. Nobody has the right to tell you what to spend your money on. But the way that I get around that problem, and this might be unsatisfactory to you, is I think it's true that no individual has the right to force me to give up however much money I have so that their daughter can go to college or whatever. But I think the demos, when we go to the polling station, when we vote, that's when the collective can make decisions about how much or how little everyone has to collectively sacrifice to have individual liberties that come in the form of certain security nets.
Well, I think there's no doubt whatsoever that there's a moral legitimacy to at least pay for the structures of society that guarantee security, safety, the protection of individual rights. That to me is just, I can't imagine an argument against that, although there are anarchists, who think that, nobody has a right to tell me anything. Right. But like, that's the whole premise of civilization or of society, and I think Hobbes was right about this, even though he was wrong in other ways, that any societal structure is kind of better than none. Like living in a state of society is a priori better than every man for himself or woman for herself in a state of nature. Yeah. Right. So like, yeah, it's and Rand agrees that, a government is necessary for the affordances that you're talking about, right? For us to be able to have the kind of life in which human beings, qua social, rational animals, can flourish. It's absolutely necessary. I mean, we could live like animals only, sure we can, but it's in all of our interests. And I don't know if that's a collectivist or an individualist argument, but it's in all of our interests to have a society, right? Well, the egoist will say, well, it's in our enlightened self-interest, right? It's in my self-interest to be an altruist in certain ways so that we could have a society, right?
Yeah. I think I'm an egoist. I don't believe in altruism, but go on.
Yeah, well, you can give an egoistic argument for, I don't mean altruism in the sense, when the Randians use the word altruism, they mean something very strong and specific that I don't think ordinary people, when they say altruistic, mean what they mean. The ordinary term for altruism is just, actions or policies that take into consideration other people's interests, right? So the enlightened egoism view, as it's called, is simply the recognition that from a purely non-altruistic, self-interested perspective, it's in my interest to cooperate with other reciprocating members of society so we could have a system that benefits us all, right? Which is the security system of a society, right? The basic security of a society. So that's rational self-interest, which is a kind of altruistic thing, not in the Randian sense, but almost like an economic self-interest. It's in your self-interest to be a reciprocating member of society.
Yeah. I would want to avoid, I suppose, the kind of altruistic definition, which is about putting other people above yourself.
Right. That's what the Randians are against, the sacrificial lamb version of altruism, as if the collective or others, whether it's a subset or the whole set of the other, self and other. Altra means other in Latin, right? Or otro in Spanish, right? Otherism, right? Selfism or otherism, right? So the Randians say, well, no, you never put anybody before you. Of course, if it's a loved one of yours and you care about them, then it's your self-interest projected on them that you're serving. You're not serving them, right? This kind of thing. And I'm fine with that. It's just a semantic thing, as far as I could tell.
I mean,
clear about what we mean. We could use the term, but Randians are very particular about terms, and that's a good thing philosophically. But like when I've debated with some of them, or just even had ordinary discussions with them, if you use a term in the generic sense, like
coercion,
any one of these terms, it's very loaded, and it's almost like some of them, I can't say they're all like this, because some of them are not like that, but some of them have kind of bought into a kind of lexicon of Randian terms that are defined a certain way. And it's as if the same terms, which are homonyms in a sense, because they have another meaning in ordinary language, don't have the ordinary language meanings that they have. And it's like you're equivocating with them. Even when you say, no, I don't mean it in that sense.
Yeah.
I mean it in this sense, right?
Exactly. They don't think anything other than a person can be coercive. They don't think a situation can be coercive. And I think that's totally at odds with the way that we use the term coercion. Coercion can be used to describe situations rather than people.
Right. Right. So this is the distinction. These are the language games, as Wittgenstein would call them. And that's why people like Bertrand Russell, said the first thing we need to do is define our terms, right? Otherwise, we're talking past each other. It's a waste of time, really. Like, okay, by this term, this is what I mean. By that, so there are different kinds of ways in which individuals can be manipulated into making choices that are not necessarily in their self-interest, whether the manipulation, and there's a problem, manipulation always seems to be by an agent, but no, conditions can be manipulative, right? Yeah. You can create conditions that have a manipulative effect on somebody, even if you didn't intend that, whatever. So
hence the phrase, I was between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the underlying motive for resisting the use of the word coercion in those cases is to resist the kinds of arguments about institutional impact, that certain institutions unintentionally can have a negative adverse impact on certain groups of people, right? Okay, you don't want to call it coercion, call it something else.
Yeah, no, I know. And as infuriating as some of the Randians can be, I still have a lot of Randian friends. One of my favorite sociologists, Nikos Soterakopoulos, is a Randian. I'll be interviewing him about his book on tribalism in a couple of months. So I do take influence from and take Randians seriously, even though I disagree with him about the welfare state. And I'm not a collectivist capitalist. But the people that I find much more infuriating and frightening are people on the other side, people on the left.
Yeah, me too. I guess we can go down that road, but before we do, I'll say that, all my criticisms that I've just verbalized and that you have, I think, about Randians are not meant to be derogatory in any way, shape, or form. Like, I really respect these people, even though it can be frustrating to play those language games, and to try to wiggle out of them and everything, and I personally find that, well, most of them that I've ever met, most of them are very philosophically interesting. They care about their beliefs and values. They care about being consistent. They care about integrating the disparate parts of their ideology. Like, they've got a lot of epistemic virtues. Virtue epistemology is a relatively new field. I don't know if you've done any reading on it, but that's important to me. And I find that camp has a lot of what the virtue epistemologists would say are epistemic virtues.
Yes.
Right. Where there's a lot of people on the left, on the other side, who are kind of somehow or another equivalent to them in terms of cultish behavior, or what might be dogmatism, or language games and things like that. I don't sense the same level of virtue epistemology and I don't mean to be disparaging like that, but that's my impression.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should put it like this. There are good people and nuanced positions all over the political spectrum.
Absolutely.
So there are good left-wing and right-wing and center people. No one's disputing that. But what is fashionable on the left seems to be stuff that has become part of pop culture, our major institutions, academia, television, you name it. And it's stuff that seems to be on the surface trying to call out for justice, but in actual fact is relying on conspiracy theories, narcissism and sadism. That's how I would describe it.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, once you started saying that, I thought maybe, maybe that was unfair, my characterization, um, the way that I put it, epistemic virtues. But I'm not sure if I was wrong. So but that's just my interpretation, my understanding in terms of the battles that I've had with people on both sides. Like, you're right, there are closed-minded people who maybe I would say lack epistemic virtues across the political spectrum. So it's unfair of me to make generalizations like that. I don't have statistics. I'm going on my own anecdotal experiences in arguing and debating with people. But yeah, I like the way that you characterized the difference.
Well, let's say it's fashionable if you're an asshole on the right to behave like a troll, whereas it's fashionable if you're an asshole on the left to behave like a very effective bully who gets many other powerful people on your side and produces change rather quickly in a way that the troll does not.
Yeah.
I mean, this is ironically how we met. So this is probably an interesting story to tell. I didn't know you except that we were Facebook friends for some reason. I think we were friends of friends, maybe. And you had a post that you did, I think this was 2 or 3 years ago, about Liam Neeson. Do you remember that?
Yeah, one moment. It's getting a little dark in my room. I want to see if I could put this light on here. There you go.
Okay.
I don't know if that changes the optics too much. Now I look a little orange.
Look at the Wizard of Oz. It's great.
Yeah.
But no, you were doing this
Horse of a different color.
Liam Neeson. And at that time, it was like a free-for-all. Every other week, there was some ridiculous story about some celebrity saying something very innocuous. And then all these leftists and progressive people would say that celebrity is a piece of shit and they should be banished from civilization.
Right. I forgot about the Liam Neeson thing. He said he followed somebody. He was thinking of hurting them because he thought they did something wrong, and he had a racial thought about it or something.
He said that like in the early 70s, a woman he knew was raped by a black man. He had very racist feelings after that. He went on the streets for a couple of weeks or whatever with a kosh, looking for a black bastard who would behave badly so he could use it. And then he realized that was horrible. And he spent many years of therapy and introspection to acknowledge and get rid of that part of himself. So it was a kind of triumph over evil story.
Yeah.
But people interpreted that as he's a racist piece of shit. How dare he?
Right. There's no redemption, right? For him, it was a redemption and transformation and self-transcendence thing for the good, and a brave, courageous thing to confess publicly that was completely unnecessary. So he was trying, in my view, to promote awareness of the ways in which we might have residual implicit bias and why it would be good to address it and try to overcome it, and that it's a good thing to do and it's something to be proud of. And yeah, they trashed him. Yeah. And so I protect the underdog. So I tried to defend him.
You defended him. I came on your thread randomly to sort of defend something you said. And then this like avalanche of angry people just piled on me. And it felt like being like Bruce Lee in one of those movies when like 20 guys come at him at once. But it was just like ad hominem after
my experience on a regular basis around that time, on that thread and so many others. Oh my God. Yeah.
And what was fascinating to me is that initially they thought I was going to be easy. So they threw out the ad hominems, but I kept arguing back. And then they kept saying things to the effect of, well, you're not an expert. we're academics. And I said, no, I have a PhD in philosophy. I study these things too. And then they were saying things like, well, you have a PhD in analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is conservative. And it kept going and going and going. And it was really shocking to me that people who were this educated were this playgroundish in defending this bizarre position, which is actually quite difficult to defend. How can you call somebody a racist when they're giving you like a triumph over racism story? But they were doing it, and they were acting like anybody who took the other position was like somebody from the KKK or somebody who needed medication, just the scum of the earth. And I couldn't understand it. It was like it was like watching some sort of like collective mental breakdown more than it was having like a political argument.
Crazy, yeah. I remember that. At the time, I don't remember what year that was, but it was probably after Trump got elected.
It was 18 or 19, I think.
Yeah, because in my historical memory, this kind of polarization and piling on and straw manning and all that kind of stuff, the troll, you know, the bully trolling and all that, that just, there was always a little bit of that for me in my social media networks. But after Trump got elected, it started to snowball, and that snowball kept rolling down the hill and getting bigger and bigger. And yeah, by the time you stumbled into one of my threads there, yeah, I had been having battles like that with people on a daily basis. Very stressful to have people accuse you of all this. And it's not just the accusations. It's like you said about the religious folks, that the burden, they act as if the burden's on you to explain to them why you could still be moral even if you don't believe in God, you know, rather than the other way around. Like, you believe in somebody who wanted Abraham to kill his own son, and you think you're more on the moral high ground relative to me when I don't believe in crazy stories like that, right? You know, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, they would all come at you with these presuppositions, like just like it was completely normal and acceptable in there, because they're in the consensus. It's their kangaroo court. There's more of them than people like us who are willing to speak out and say, I have a slightly different opinion about this, you know, like, rah, they all jump on you. And what blows my mind is that aspect of it where they just take for granted that anybody who has a slightly different view is completely insane. And it's kind of like Plato's cave to me, you know, they're all the prisoners in the cave. They're all looking at the same shadows. I'm sure you know the story if you're a philosopher,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, and they're all, and like the guy comes in and says, you know, it's not really the shadows, it's the, and they're like all ready to kill you. Like, what are you talking about, you idiot? Can't you see the shadows, you know? That's what it's like. Like, it's one cave after another in social media. And I feel like I'm that guy who goes in there and says, you know what, there's a world outside where people think slightly differently from you. Rah! You know, and just
those are fascists.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the phrases that I really like to me, this is so reminiscent of sophistry, the age of the sophists.
Yes, very
right?
much. That's such an astute point.
Yeah. And Socrates, you know, trying to do battle with them because the language that they use, one of the things, like the sophistry is incredible. I remember this phrase, oh, you're alt-right adjacent. Maybe you're not alt-right, but you're alt-right adjacent.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're alt-right adjacent. Like if you're not now Nazi, you're alt-right adjacent. And you have an obligation because silence is violence.
Yeah.
To speak out against those people who you socialize with. I wouldn't even put that on my platform. How dare you? Why would you share something like that if you don't, you know, just say, hey, you know what? Philosophers like to examine ideas. Excuse me.
Yeah, well, what I would say is in a climate of polarization where one side has gone crazy, you have to be alt-right adjacent because people who don't like identity politics, who agree with you, are going to be on the alt-right. And if you don't want anything in common with them, that means you have to side with the left. So that's, you know, avoiding the problem.
Yeah.
So I think polarization actually necessitates that you side with nasty people sometimes when you both agree on stuff that's important to say. It's just
right, like liberal values.
Exactly. It's a very difficult mind fuck because it really does feel like these aren't political conversations. It feels like this is some sort of weird psychological kind of speaking in tongues hysteria. I mean, I first noticed this, I don't know if when you first noticed this, but in 2014,
characterization.
In 2014 was when I first started noticing it. And the first issue that people got like this about was feminism. because at that time there was Gamergate and all that kind of stuff. And what I noticed was you could have really sensible, articulate conversations about issues that if things went wrong, everybody dies. Like if the economy goes wrong, everybody starves and dies. If foreign policy goes wrong, we blow up the planet. But yet, if you mentioned anything about how, we didn't live in a culture of pervasive misogyny, where it was okay to call women bossy if they were, people would be 10 times more angry with you than if you had said anything about foreign policy or the economy that could lead to the destruction of civilization. And I thought, if you're getting this angry over something this small, something psychologically is not right here. This isn't politics. This is something else. This is like the dark side of humanity manifesting itself in politics or something. It feels weird.
I agree. I don't know what to make of it fundamentally. I don't know how to I don't know how to explain my mystical experiences, but at least I have some ideas about that. I don't know how to explain this phenomenon. I don't know what it is.
Do you think people are having mystical experiences about misogyny and transphobia and racism, and that's why this is happening?
No, I don't think so.
Because it does seem like the pathway towards accepting these beliefs could be similar to the pathway towards believing supernatural things on the basis of experiences that seem strange. Does it not?
Well, maybe you're tapping into something about human nature that inclines us toward conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are attractive because they are overarching versions of what the postmodernists call a master narrative, right? And we're in an age where we no longer have master narratives. So there's a kind of meaning crisis. Human beings need to have a kind of master narrative, and conspiracy theories, well, we're just kind of built to be susceptible to them because they tap into our need for and our skill at using what cognitive scientists call, relevance realization, right? Relevance realization is just an ability. It's hard to define, what's relevant to what, but, evolution has gifted our brains with a multi-tiered, dynamical system that goes top down and bottom up, of realizing, identifying, realizing, constructing, whatever, relevance, right? So conspiracy theories have massive relevance realization value in them, like they're massively coherent. They would explain all sorts of things if they were true, right? So, and religion is a master narrative. And in the post-religious world, we're in a kind of existential confusion, and there's a tremendous historical or cultural memory of us having meaning that we no longer have. So there's a kind of craving for some model that makes sense of the world, right? So suspicion that what explains, the lack of happiness in my life might be that I'm a person of color or a woman or this or that, or da, da, da. And then now that's become a kind of collective mantra that's what it is. And that's the primary problem, not economic collapse, nuclear war. None of those things matter. What matters is whether or not somebody misgendered me or something like that, because it taps into that whole myth of, the master narrative that explains everything that's wrong with the world today, right? It's this globally, comprehensive narrative that provides meaning, and it also gets me off the hook of being responsible for my own agency and how I use it.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about a word that's bandied about quite a lot, which I think actually might be narcissism in disguise. I'm curious what you think about this. And the word is marginalization.
Oh.
Now, when people use the word marginalization, one of the primary connotations is oppression of some sort. But when you look at what the marginalization definition implies, it's not being part of the dominant group of your society, and feeling like you are less visible or less heard because of that. Now, it seems to me that because there are an infinite amount of sub-demographics in any society, you can carve it up in an infinite amount of ways, everyone by that definition is marginalized in some way. And if everyone is marginalized, it can't be a form of oppression.
Right.
So to demand to not be marginalized is almost to demand something most people don't demand about being seen. When you demand things about being seen that most people don't demand, doesn't that mean you're narcissistic?
Yeah, I forget who said it. It might have been James Lindsay, one of those grievance studies guys.
Mm-hmm.
Was that mine or yours? Because I thought I shut off all my.
Oh, that was mine. Don't worry
Yeah.
about it. I'll edit it out. I'll edit it out.
Okay. It's like about look at me, right? You know, like the person at the apex of the intersectionality oppression pyramid who has every conceivable form of marginalization, right? Is, you know, really the super narcissist, right? It's just like, look at me, right? And that person would almost be like a high priest of that master narrative thing that I was talking about, right? I am the ultimate victim.
Because I'm not seen.
Yeah, right.
And what's interesting also is a lot of culture seems to be really impacted by this marginalization stuff, even when it's not political. Like there's a lot of sex positivity culture, which is about sort of trying to normalize sexual imagery in the public. And they often use language to the effect that it's oppressive for sexuality not to be liberated. And liberation means showing it to others with no boundaries. That seems narcissistic as well, in a way which is connected to the marginalization idea that's floating around in all of the institutions in pop culture at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, look at me. I agree. It's definitely narcissistic.
So do you think the answer is to say, don't look at me? How do we deal with this problem?
Yeah, I really don't know. Look, I had a meeting at the college recently in which one of the women faculty members, it happened to be the case that I think the majority of the faculty members, I don't know if the administration there, I don't remember. No, the majority of them happen to be males. And there was a kind of faction of the males taking a similar view. And it was against a certain proposal that a woman faculty member had made. But I really don't, I can't imagine that anybody in 2021 in New York City would reject a view because it was offered by a woman. But one of the other women who sided with the proposal said something about her epistemic authority as someone who specializes in, she didn't use the term, but she used cognate language to say that she was an expert on the issue of marginalization of women's voices in academia or something like that, or she teaches a course on it or whatever. And she said, and I just want to bring attention to the, that we should all take notice of what the majority of the voices are that we've been hearing here today. Like, nobody is stopping you from speaking. Like, it just baffles my mind. This is the thing to me, like, this narrative has become so much the norm that people speak it as if it's, mathematically true or something. It's just absurd to me.
Yeah. Well, what I would say to her is, okay, if you think the minority is that epistemically virtuous and the majority is that epistemically suspect, why would you want to live in a democracy? Because democracy is majority rule. Why would you want that if you think the majority is that suspect?
Yeah, I believe it might be the same faculty member, and I have to speak in the abstract here, who once said in response to like a number of the junior faculty at my institution have been clamoring for governance review and governance change. We have an elected governmental body that's very inclusive in terms of we have administrators, staff, faculty, and students. Every wing of the college is represented on the college council. And so some of the junior faculty who have these ideologies and who believe that they are marginalized and they want institutional power, they have been pressing an agenda that we need a governance review and whatnot, right? And I remember making a claim in response to one of these allegations that, well, everybody in the governance body was elected by everybody in the college. So it's democratic, right? Like, I don't understand, you know. and her response was something like, well, it's a historically proven fact or something about how the status quo, you know, tends to marginalize whatever. It's just like the conspiracy theory was thrown back at me as a justification for itself. Mm-hmm. Like, and I was dumbfounded. I was literally speechless. Like a lot of times that's what happens to me in these encounters. I just can't believe what PhD intellectuals are speaking publicly as if it makes sense.
Yeah.
It just
tell her you are the status quo.
Yeah, really. Yeah, you're a member of the privileged, you know, but.
Well, it's very fascinating to me because, I mean, something we've also talked about on Facebook, which I'm very uncertain about. You might have some inclinations about how to deal with this problem that are better than my own, but I don't know how to fight this problem sensibly, because it seems to me like the activists themselves are very frenetic and self-destructive. They're not like Hitler or Stalin, because Hitler and Stalin, they knew what they were doing. They were very strategic. They waited until they got power to turn on other people who were supporting them. You know, they really were good dictators in a way that these new activists are not. They're really frenetic. But it seems like the people who are doing work on their behalf to transform Western culture into this horrible intersectional, tyrannical, China-like state, if it goes that far, are bureaucrats. It's not the activists. Do you sense that where you work? Is it bureaucrats that are doing this rather than activists?
There's this kind of symbiotic relationship between the two. The activists bang the drum, kind of like protesters marching out on the street, right? Which terrorizes, you know, even though they're just verbally making all kinds of complaints and allegations and narratives that are, you know, endlessly beating the same drum about how the system stinks, right? The administration hears that as potential marches on campus or potential items in the Daily News or the New York Times. And some of them, you know, have sued the college with these allegations, right? What looks like just accusation of marginalization, or because I'm in an identity group, that's why this happened, right? That allegation, like, oh, because I'm a trans person, or I'm a woman, or I'm a person of color, that's why I didn't get tenure, or whatever it is, right? And so, and then the administration gets sued, or there's articles that appear in local newspapers. So, you know, our reputation goes down, and the other presidents in the CUNY is a big system. So I'm just talking about CUNY, but then you've got the chancellor and the board of trustees. So there's pressure on the presidents, and the presidents put the pressure on the provost. And so, and like anything they could do to shut up and appease these people, they'll do it because they're afraid of lawsuits. They're afraid of losing their jobs. They're cowardly, in my opinion, when it comes to this sort of thing. And they just give in to the least common denominator to put out fires, and they have no long-term understanding that you're training the baby to cry. Mm-hmm. Let the baby cry and fall asleep. Yeah. Right? By picking up the baby every time it cries, you're just training it to do that, right? So that's my interpretation of what's going on. Like every time they reward one of these initiatives, it just gets stronger.
One of
And
the
it's,
things that,
it's spreading across societies, as you know, Google, all these different companies, Coca-Cola, like it's just ridiculous. What Victoria's Secret got rid of its models. I forget what they call their new pageant of models, the Collective, ironically. I heard about this on the Daily Objective in a recent podcast, maybe a month or so ago. Yeah, and those are all, people who are like maybe overweight or, in all these different categories. No, seriously, they've completely changed their branding. And you know what? The capitalists say, let's see how well that works. But you never know, because maybe what they did is open up their market. They might lose a lot of really, fit women customers, but they might gain a lot more. Who knows? But like,
they're trying to show, well, they're trying to encourage people to say, I have a virtuous boner, as opposed to an ableist, racist, sexist, fattest boner.
Well, that's, fat shaming, there's fat studies now and all that kind of thing. So
one of the things that I'm very
deconstructing of all the previous norms of society, and,
absolutely,
a lot of that deconstruction is good. A lot of the deconstruction is good. There's no doubt about it. But
what I'm confused about is, if these people say that they're most frightened of the right, why are they not frightened of right-wing protesters the way that they're frightened of left-wing protesters?
Yeah, I agree. I think the awareness of that hypocrisy is why the media and the government in the United States made such an exaggerated reaction to the insurrection of the Capitol on January 6th. I mean, come on. After all the rioting and the burning down of federal buildings and cops being attacked and whatnot, like that was going on for almost a year, with the Black Lives Matter protests and everything, that, the media and the government was like, well, it was mostly peaceful, mostly peaceful protests. And it's understandable. And we support it. And, blah, blah, people's, the right to protest is an American thing. And, but when it came to that one event, it was like, whoa, they're trying to take over the country. The right-wing lunatics, right? That's not what happened.
So do you think psychologically what's going on is they see angry left-wing protesters, they think these people could make our lives miserable. They see angry right-wing protesters, they think these people should be in jail. Is that what's going on?
In a way, because they're locking them up. They didn't hunt down hardly anybody, who did all that other stuff.
So it's like, these are bad people. You don't listen to bad people no matter how much they shriek. The other people are good people. Is that what it is?
This is there's two fallacies here: special pleading and the fundamental attribution error, which I like to unite. One is a logical error. The other one is a psychological error. Special pleading is like double standard. You see a standard that should apply on both sides, yours and your opponent's. And when your side violates the standard, you make a special plea that there were special circumstances that explain your side's justifiable violation of the standard, but you don't afford the same consideration to the other side. That's the fallacy of special pleading, or just double standard fallacy. But in psychology, the fundamental attribution error is like what you said about evil, that the very same standard, when it's violated by our enemies, is attributed to a fundamental characteristic of their essential nature. They're evil. That's why they did that, because they're bad. They're evil. They're alt-right, they're Trumpers, right? Or whatever, whereas when we do the very same thing, right? When we engage in the same, we're doing it for a just cause. We're on the right side of history. We're progressive, for Christ's sake. Our morals are correct. Those people are not. So yes, protesting and violating the law, it's a necessary thing for change. All political change has only come about through violent struggle and blah, 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 excuse after excuse. Those apply only to us because we're the good folks and we're on the right side of history, right? And like, so when we violate those things, we have explanations for them that are rational and justifiable, right? And they don't implicate us as being evil, but it implicates them when they do the exact same thing. But really, it begs the question because we're just assuming that they're evil to begin with.
Yeah. I suppose what disturbs me, I wish I could find a way to understand this better philosophically, is it seems to me that 10 years ago, 2013, we had a lot of problems, but we didn't have such an extreme left operating with such an extreme right. We had a political spectrum and political conversation that was more sane. That's why a lot of people actually complained we were living in a depoliticized era. But it seems like what happened after 2014 is the left got really, really extreme on social issues and started achieving things by bullying, and no one could see it. What I'm curious about is why nobody could see it when it was so obvious. What is it in the psychology of 2013 that made people incapable of seeing extremism on the left when it happened in the subsequent years? What was that?
Yeah, I really don't know. I'm not sure. But, there were voices, there were prophets out there in the wilderness saying, this doesn't look good. You see that? That's a bad sign of things to come. The fact that that's normalized is bad, blah, 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 blah. And everybody's like, oh, no, you're exaggerating. That's an individual instance, explain it away, explain it away, explain it away, explain it away. And now it's like, boom, it's like, now we have like rehabilitation camps practically,
Oh God, what I've been hearing about what's happening in American public school, let alone higher education, is terrifying to me. Are you guys getting critical race theory to school children in New York at the moment?
That's what I keep reading about. It's happening all over the United States. It's being normalized.
So, I mean, this is stuff that was controversial when it was taught in colleges 5 years ago. Now it's being taught to grade schoolers.
Well, it's kind of being, I don't want to make it seem like it's conspiratorial. I don't know. I don't know enough to talk about intentions on a conspiratorial level, but it is going in. And it is going in a kind of innocuous packaging. It's not necessarily being called critical race theory, but
of course,
right, but it's kind of being slipped in everywhere, not just academia, all these corporations and whatever. I just saw a great Netflix show, only 4 episodes of it, and then it's over. The Chair, did you see it?
No, I haven't. I must put that on my list.
Put that on your list because it's a chairperson of a department in a college.
Oh,
and yeah, and she's the first woman of color. Well, she's Asian, but they were still treating it like she's a woman of color because that's an issue, whether or not Asians are really white, depending on what part of Asia they're from, right? Mm-hmm. According to this ideology. But then she gets upset with like one of her, like when you said earlier, good dictators like Hitler and Stalin, right? So one of her English teachers made some kind of reference, a critical reference to totalitarianism as a direction we have to worry about. And he just like made the Nazi signal with his hand or something like that. You don't want that to happen. And like students brought him up on charges and the chair had to, they happen to be in a relationship, but she had to fire him and try to fire him or whatever. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoiler alert the thing, but all these issues came up there. I lost my train of thought of why I brought it up. What were we speaking about a moment ago? I got excited.
The impact of critical race theory on education.
Oh yeah, critical race theory. Thank you. So when she was criticizing some of the older faculty, because the administration was complaining about the older faculty, nobody was taking their classes and whatnot. When she was trying to argue with one of them that they need to come on board, it's been 20 years since, where you're at as a teacher and this, that, and the other thing, you got to be on board. You got to learn about this. You got to learn about that. You've got critical race theories, just slip that in there. Like it was one of the normal new pedagogical things that faculty should be kind of employing in their pedagogy. Mm-hmm. And even though the show depicted her as somebody not advocating identity politics and all of that, and having to protect her faculty member and everything, they put it in her mouth as if it was a normal thing that is in academia, like, accepted. And I just thought, well, that's not accurate. But this is the kind of thing I think what happens is, here's the dynamic that I think might explain it. Whenever you speak out about any of these things that you see coming down the pike, that you have intellectual reservations about, or that you think is more nuanced than the way it's being presented, right? If you open up your mouth and say something about it, there's a generic or consensual, there's a kind of consensual response where people know that that might not be politically correct. And somebody might get points if they point that out to you in one way, shape, or form or another. And then everybody learns vicariously to keep their mouth shut about these things. That's been going on. That was going on in the 2010s, in my opinion, right? That you started, right? In my college, you start hearing people say things at like big town hall meetings or whatever, when the president would say, all right, so let's hear from you guys. What do you think we need to, how can we improve things around here, whatever? And somebody get up and say, well, I think our students need to see more faculty who look like them, right? Now, like, on the one hand, the intention behind that is good, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with our students if they can identify with their faculty members, but all the other implications of that are like about affirmative action. We have too many white men on campus, all that kind of stuff. And like, who could say anything against that? If you say anything, well, I don't think that's what they really need. What they really need is a better education or whatever. It has nothing to do with whether or not the faculty resemble them in some artificial way that has validity for your identity politics, but that has no pedagogical value, right? Then if you said something like that, even just as an intellectual person who argues with colleagues about ideas, which is something we used to be able to do without stepping on identity politics landmines, right? If you say anything against one of those things, you get ostracized and people criticize you about it. And then there's a talking campaign behind your back and whatever, and people, that's the kind of informal dynamics that enabled this thing to grow to the level that it did. It's kind of like, just think of I said it's like the sophistry of really clever language. And I don't know if it's intentional, but we're in an age of sophistry where just think of the brilliance of the name Black Lives Matter. All right. So if you oppose the protests, or you oppose the socialism that's at the head of that organization, right? Or it's anti-American values, anti-family values, whatever, right? The immediate thing that people are going to accuse you of is that you don't think Black Lives Matter, right? So, there's something about the language and the vicarious learning not to mess with it that I think put a kind of, muzzle on people's ability to speak freely, and maybe prevent a lot of these ideas from festering and growing and becoming the norm, to the point where somebody like you pops on my thread and says one innocuous thing and everybody's like, yeah.
Okay. Well, I suppose
it's getting dark in here. I want to remove these things that block my way too much light coming in from the window, and then turn on another light in here.
Okay, not a problem.
I can hear you though, unless you want to just wait and then.
Okay. Can you see me okay?
I can see you great, but
okay.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. It's all right.
I have way too much light in this room in the daytime. If I use the screens, but then, okay, now with the light behind me, it might still make me, no, this seems okay for now. All right.
So I suppose what I'm curious about is what would happen if at one of these meetings, let's say, you stood up and you said, you know what, actually, I think if our students need people to look like themselves in order to be successful or feel like they can relate to people, that means the students are racist. That's not a character virtue, that's a character vice that we don't want to accommodate, because you can't control in life whether people will look like you or not when you encounter them. And that shouldn't be the criteria by which you take them seriously. Neither should your ability to relate to them. You know, the fact that you might not relate to a teacher means maybe the teacher's teaching you about something that somebody you could relate to could not teach you. What would happen if you said something like that?
Yeah, no, I have said things like that. And sorry about the lighting here, but it's been brought to my attention by friends of mine who don't speak out. And so those who would criticize me would feel like they could tell those friends of mine, right? Because they don't know that they're my allies, right? So it gets back to me that whenever I would open my mouth and make a remark like that, that I was being depicted as somebody like Jordan Peterson or something, you know? Yeah, no, really, I made some kind of remark about equity at one of these meetings where I said that I have philosophical problems with the way that that's understood and implemented. I believe that there's good and bad ideas associated with it, or whatever. I forget how I word it. It was something innocuous and totally rational and reasonable and charitable, right? But one of these, you know, zealots went around, actually said that they didn't even want to work with me because I can't work with him. He's against equity. Like, and I never said I was against equity. I said I was against certain aspects of how it's implemented as a policy.
Well, again, that's an example of taking something which is controversial, trying to smuggle it in the public value system by acting like anything other than that thing is pure evil and worthy of social admonishment.
Right, and that's what I said about the vicarious learning. So people see Rick open up his mouth, and I have a reputation for doing that, which is a good thing as far as I could tell. It comes at a cost, but it's important to have courage and have some virtue and speak the truth of what you believe. But all the onlookers, they see what happens, what people start saying about Rick, and they don't want to be in that category. So they never open up their mouths. They'll come over to me, by the Xerox machine and say, "Oh, Rick, I just want to let you know, hooray, man. Wow, keep up the good fight." And I'm like, I could use a little help every now and then,
Yeah. Well, I find, the way that I deal with these sorts of people, and we all have different strategies, but my strategy is, okay, you want to bully me? I'm going to make it as hard as possible for you. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep saying things back at you. And however mean you are at me, I'm going to escalate it back to you. However polite you are, however anal you are, I'm going to mimic it back to you. And I'm not going to stop.
I love it. I've seen that. Yes.
And if you go crazy, and go in a rage, I've won. Because if I lost,
very impressive, Greg. You have much more patience and endurance than I do. When things reach a certain point, I'll delete the thread. I'm like, I had enough of this. I delete the thread, or I'll just X them out. That I'm unfriending you. That's it. You crossed the line. I had enough.
I suppose with me, I was bullied really badly as a kid.
Yeah, me too. I'm an anti-bullier.
But before I was bullied, I was a boxer. And I stopped boxing because I accidentally broke my dad's nose.
Wow.
When I was about 7 years old. And when I could see I could hurt someone, I was like, I'm never going to do that again. And that's why I was not a boxer, even though I was a huge boxing fan, and still am, if I'm honest. But when I was bullied because I wouldn't fight back, I think I did myself a disservice by not fighting back. So that when people try and bully me now, I will never, ever not fight back. Even to the point of losing other people who like me.
Right.
I'll always fight back. so that's part of my nature. That's part of my character. I'm just annoying, I suppose.
I have the same disposition.
It reminds me of like that scene in Back to the Future where Biff is, he's got George McFly on the floor and he's breaking his arm. And Lorraine is saying, help, help. And then finally out of nowhere, he punches Biff in the face and Biff does like this pirouette across the car park and lands on a car. I always found that scene, like, most people cry at sad scenes in movies. I cried at that scene because the bully's getting his comeuppance and having someone stand up to him, that's very emotionally moving to me. The movie Straw Dogs is very emotionally moving to me because Dustin Hoffman beats up and kills a bunch of bullies at the end. That I'm like, that's so moving, man. That's so great.
I feel the same.
My wife and all my past girlfriends, when I've showed that movie to them, they're like, why are you crying? This isn't a crying movie. This is horrible.
Yeah. I have the exact same dispositions, and I have this other interesting element to my history, that I lived for 10 years from ages 3 to 13 in a New York City public housing projects in Queens.
Oh my God.
Which by the time we moved out was 99 point something percent, well, people of color. The majority of them were Black and a minority of them were Hispanic. But mine was literally one of the last handful of white families to move out of this huge housing complex. So over the course of my childhood, the bullies picking on me weren't always, but as the neighborhood became increasingly Black, almost always Black and bigger than me, and picking on me because I was white. And the racial hatred, the epithets and everything, were always a part of it. So like when people accuse me, like I because of that experience, it was beat into my head how bad racism is by being a victim of it almost every day of my life. Growing up, I had to fight all the time, and got mugged a million times, and you name it. So when anybody ever accuses me of having white privilege, it's like the hair on my neck goes up. Or anybody ever accuses me of being bigoted in any way, shape, or form. Like after going through that kind of hell as a kid, like I have PTSD from it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I'm so protective of victims of bullying or the underdog of any kind. It doesn't matter. I just have very powerful instincts in that direction. And it doesn't matter who or what they are, that's just my nature.
Yeah. No, I understand that. I mean, the term white privilege, it makes me enraged as well. But I have to stand back and say the person using this phrase probably isn't thinking about what it means. Yeah. Because on a superficial level, I would say to them, okay, white person has privilege, so what? And then they would probably say something, well, then they should behave better. And then I'd say, okay, why do you think it's their responsibility at the individual level to redistribute this privilege rather than some sort of structural change? And the more they would try and explain it and justify it, the less it would make sense. And the more it would be like this weird emotional thing, like, say a Hail Mary or something. It seems like it's coming from that same place in their brain. It's not even well thought out. And people who often use that language, they haven't read the Unpacking the White Privilege Knapsack paper that started this all in the 80s. Whereas I had to read that paper in like 2003 when I was a grad student. So I know what these ideas are. And when people use them like they're using religious language, I almost don't even want to engage because I don't feel like they're using that term in the same way that I was using it as a grad student. It's like they don't know or care what it means. It's more about something emotional.
Yeah, it's not only that. It's one of these, like I said, the distinction between sophistry and fallacy is that sophistry is the intentional use of fallacy, right?
Mhm.
So it's just like lying and uttering a falsehood that you believe. Lying requires that you know that you're uttering a falsehood, right? And at
Mhm.
least there's that distinction that you could make, right? So I don't want to accuse people of sophistry, but with a lot of these kinds of behaviors, it's hard to know, and it's reasonable to think that there's a spectrum between fallacy and sophistry, and that as you get, like, say there's a midpoint and you're more toward the sophistry side, I don't think it's necessary for you to be conscious of the fact that you're engaging in sophistry to engage in it. If you're manipulating language, driven by emotions that are trying to manipulate others because of an advantage that you could get by disabling them or silencing them or whatever it is, you might be engaging in sophistry unwittingly or unconsciously. But that's a separate issue. How guilty of sophistry as opposed to fallacy an individual is in a particular case, that's an epistemological problem. And as philosophers, we try not to attribute motives to.
You're frozen temporarily because I think of thunder. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Sorry about that. I think you have a thunderstorm where you are. I saw some light behind you.
Very powerful storm, and power went out for like 2 seconds or whatever. And my wife, I had to go reset it.
So where were we? What were you saying? I'm
I
apologizing if I don't remember quite what your sentence was.
I don't even remember what topic we were on. I think, would it have something to do with
Fallacies.
sophistry?
Yes, sophistry. You said people don't know that they're being engaging in sophistry when they are. Sometimes.
Yeah, and what I had in mind was like those remarks that people make that you were saying, oh, I'll reason with them about, like,
White privilege.
Yeah, white privilege. Yeah. So that's what we were talking about. So yeah, like, people just don't think these things through. They don't realize that they're making all sorts of fallacious assumptions. But I like the way that you said, turn it around on them, and say, like with the example of students needing to see faculty who look like them. What does that imply about the students?
Well, I mean, you could even say, all right, if there were some white children in Japan, do you think it would be important for them to encounter some white teachers rather than Japanese teachers?
Right.
Probably the progressive would say no.
Right. Yeah, this is a kind of a thing I've been aware of for a long time, how there's some kind of implicit privilege in this view, so to speak, that us elite, educated, Western, Anglo-philosophical minds, sociologists, political theorists, and everything, we're enlightened. So we're in some kind of transcendental, objective, clear viewing perspective, almost like what Nagel would call the view from nowhere. Like, we don't have any biases or attachments or commitments. We don't have a worldview. And we're not entitled to one because we're so enlightened. Whereas all those other people, right, like, the Japanese teachers, like, oh, well, these are more primitive cultures. They're more backward. They're less educated. These are like in the background of this way of thinking. Like, we have to honor what would Alistair McIntyre and Wittgenstein would call like ways of life, or these thick cultures with their thick concepts. Like, they're entitled to these kind of bizarro views, like the religious views or whatever, however backward they are or morally primitive they are or whatever it is. And we can't really criticize. It's cultural relativism, right? That kind of says, gives everybody else a pass except us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because so we're somehow or another elevated into some objective, universal, superior perspective, but we're not entitled to have any cultural norms of our own or any values of our own. Like, there's just something wrong about that whole mindset. I don't know.
Well,
if I've
it seems
articulated
to be
enough.
it seems to be that they think of everything in terms of rights, human rights, and the problem with human rights is they're basically incompatible with democracy. And if you're super big on human rights and you're implicitly anti-democratic, pretty soon you're going to be misanthropic and hate people, apart from a special class of people you think should be running everything that you yourself get to be a part of. So it seems to me.
Say why you think human rights perspective and democracy clash.
Well, because a human right is something that no amount of popular discontent can ever morally challenge with legitimacy. And then the question becomes, okay, well, let's say you say torture is a human right. We should never torture people. That's a human right. Okay, why isn't a welfare state a human right? Okay, why isn't gender pronouns a human right? You can go on and on and on until everything's a human right. It's very difficult to justify some things being human rights and not others. And when people are thinking in terms of everything that they're passionate about being human rights, they're implicitly thinking nobody else disagreeing with me matters all that much. And if they wind up thinking my views, which are the right views, are views the minority of humans hold because of my culture, they're going to wind up being implicitly very anti-human and very misanthropic.
Okay, I see the connection now.
I'm
also worried about, sorry if I'm derailing you because you were on your way to saying something else. I hope you remember what it was, but I wanted to ask you this earlier on when you said something about democracy. What about the worry that the majority can vote away any minority's rights?
They can, but you know, the problem is, on the other hand, the majority can also institutionalize rights for minorities that are unjust, like the right to police everyone else's language, or the right to police everyone else's concepts, or the right to police everyone else's concept of abuse.
This is the problem with democracy, in my opinion.
It can go both ways.
Yeah. That's why I think folks who like negative rights will say negative rights are not subject to democratic overturning, right? Whereas positive rights are a little more, that's problem, you know, that's where the problem is.
Well, it is a paradox, but it just seems to me that any kind of institutionalization of any norms, which is done without the consent of the people, is not going to be very stable in the long run, because making people consent to things they don't like, or actually bypassing consent, is kind of like doing on a collective level what somebody does on an individual level when they have sex with somebody without their consent. It's like rape.
Right. So I do believe in the consent of the governed, but like consent of the governed won't stop the governed when they have a majority from enslaving a minority, let's just say.
Yeah, so democracy can vote in a fascist dictatorship. That's right.
Yeah.
But the problem is any society can transform into something evil. The best society, which has the best chance of not doing that, is the democratic one.
That's true. In general, right?
Yeah.
But there's an awful lot of counterfactuals that we're just kind of presupposing what all of the things being equal looks like, because when it comes to actual conditions, you know, like we didn't know the extent to which something like Google could manipulate, you know, a worldview when we came up with these ideas. So like, you know, it's just like those radical possibilities that I brought up that could make precognition seem naturalistic and veridical at the same time, right? Like, you know, our political philosophies are predicated on a certain range of possible worlds or counterfactuals that we think are reasonable. Like when the Constitution was written, you know, certain things weren't, you know, like,
yeah,
like Google having the power that it has, you know, it just wasn't anticipated when the Constitution was written. So that being so, I worry about the potential disasters of democracies when they can be manipulated through social media and public media and everything like what's going on now. The direction that things could go in, it could, 10 years from now, we could be living in some kind of totalitarian dystopia in which folks like you and I were either sent to the gulag long ago or, re-educated or exterminated.
Podcasts will be erased. Burned in a flame.
Sorry, I derailed you about 5 minutes ago. Do you remember?
Yeah, well, I was going to say about Google. I do understand the worries people have about the internet manipulating everybody to go crazy. My suspicion is if the internet were powerful enough to do that, those things were there before the internet, and they will be there after the internet gets regulated to stop it from making people going crazy. So if the internet is that powerful, it seems like that power will always be with us, no matter what.
How to address that is the question, yeah.
Well, the real philosophical difficulty is manipulation, because manipulation almost implies that like the person who talks to you about white privilege isn't responsible for having internalized that concept. They've been manipulated. And I know I'm maybe being a hard ass, but I'm inclined to say, no, they are responsible.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. So that's a really good point. So much of the narrative on both sides implicitly denies agency.
Yeah.
And it's paternalistic. And I agree with you. But the reality is, so many, even though they're responsible, so many people who constitute the mass of, nitwits on both sides of the political divide, right? I mean, I hate to be so elitist, but most people just don't think anything through that far nowadays, but even though they have agency, they don't know what agency they have, and they don't use their agency.
Yeah, I think they're responsible for that too.
Yeah, they are. Well, this is what is it? Virtue epistemology issue, right? Like, so there are certain traits that an individual might have developed in the course of their lives when they were too young to know better, that are historically speaking, backward looking, that maybe they're not responsible for having cultivated those traits by the time they reached young adulthood, let's just say. But most virtue epistemologists will say, but there comes a time when they are at the age of reason, where they're capable of self-reflection, they're capable of recognizing, that they're dogmatic or whatever it is. And so they bear a kind of present tense and forward-looking tense responsibility for the way that they allow themselves to remain, even if they were raised by the Taliban, to be fundamentalists, and everybody around them agrees, and they're in an echo chamber, they're in a Plato's cave, okay, but once you reach the age of reason, right, and you need to work things out.
Well, somebody who grows up in Nazi Germany or who exists in the Taliban society, I'd actually be more forgiving to than somebody who lives in New York who believes in white privilege.
Yeah,
because they didn't need to do that.
Right, because in the Taliban, maybe even more so than in Nazi Germany, because the Taliban is much more of a homogeneous, culture. It's orthodox, homogeneous, closed society for the most part, and not 100%. They're exposed to some of these ideas. That's why they're, burning women, who go to school and stuff like that, because they know that they're being invaded by modernism. But they're in a much more closed society. It's homogeneous. They don't see many differences, unlike, like the Greeks back in the day, they were in between all these different cultures. So even though they called them all barbarians, right, they were being exposed more to outside influences and see, Persians and the Egyptians and the Ethiopians and these and that, they all had different legal systems and religious systems. And so after a certain while, even though they were calling them barbarians, they realized that, well, this was the better part of the sophists was they were kind of early sociologists and anthropologists and political scientists, where they realized that just the way we do it as Greeks isn't necessarily the only rational way to do things.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Right.
I mean, the way that I think of this in terms of responsibility and character attribution is none of us are angels. We all have the capacity to be seduced by something evil that worked with some character vice hardwiring that we've never expressed before. And we could go down a very dark path. I'm not going to go down the path of identity politics or Randianism, but there could be some other path in, say, 2070 that I go down, if I'm still alive, that I can't even imagine. So all of us have the capacity to be assholes who go along down a dark path. But I don't think that changes the fact that we live in a generation, unfortunately, where a huge swath of the intellectual industry, the entertainment industry, the government industry, the business industry have either become assholes or enabled assholes in a way which is morally disgusting.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, well, when it comes to business, there might be a similar relationship to the one that I said with the administration and the college, just kind of pandering, to prevent and put out fires and, put on a virtue signaling face, whatever, like, okay, this is the trend. So let's just get in on it. It might help our bottom line or something like that. Or, we don't want to be canceled. So let's just immediately jump on that. And, Gillette comes out with a commercial about toxic masculinity. Remember that one? That was hysterical. Boys will be boys.
That all that stuff really confuses me because it brings out things in me I don't like. Because when I see things like that, my instinctive response is to want to say fuck you to like effeminate men and genderqueer men, even though I've never felt that way before. But even I have a tribalistic instinct in me that I have to fight against. When I see this kind of shaming of the heteronormative, I instinctively want to shame the non-heteronormative. And then I have to go, no, wait a minute, don't do that. Because you're not against that and never have been.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure that a lot of people who are offended by being blamed implicitly for being something that they're not will then kind of almost adopt a defensive measure toward any sense in which that might be part of their identity, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with me being a straight white guy. And like, now I'm all about straight white guys, I have to defend straight white guys, and then that makes me look like some patriarchal asshole, right? And yeah, and then that might just, anybody who gets in that psychology might do what you were thinking about doing, which is then adopting like antediluvian attitudes towards everybody outside that group.
Yeah. And this is why I don't want to, in virtue of opposing the modern incarnation of the left, in a knee-jerk way, go to the right. Because a lot of what's on the right, I've never agreed with, and I haven't seen a convincing argument post-culture wars to think that it's now good. And in fact, a lot of the stuff I'm seeing on the right now that I have a lot of right-wing fans strikes me as quite intolerant, if I'm honest. Because a lot of the stuff on the right, which is very informed by the culture wars of the left, is about expressing disgust to anybody who isn't totally normal and encouraging everybody to have children and be heterosexual and not do anything weird. And all the things that Western culture seems to me to be quite valuable in allowing you to do the opposite of. It seems like the right, insofar as it hates China and prefers the West, has a consistency problem. Because its social ethics at the moment is much closer to China than to the West, which has been very influenced by the 60s, which they don't like. They want to erase the 60s.
Yeah, good points. Yeah, I'm not a right-wing person either. It's just a coincidence that after all the stuff that started happening to me in academia and seeing some of my friends or colleagues be unjustly canceled, or even just not people that I know, but other academics, you know, and you read what happened to them, or you see a video of what happened to people like Brett Weinstein and
Yeah.
all these different characters, that it immediately pushed me away from the far left. I was a progressive person. I was in a group on my campus called the Progressive Faculty Caucus. It was like almost all activists in that group. You know, I sympathized with them. I had a lot of, but the, you know, shared values and everything. But once I saw this happening, even on my own campus, I like removed myself from that, because I'm totally dead against all that. So I moved closer to the right, more in the center. I'm more in the center. And then I realized, well, I have a lot of allies on the right who agree with my liberal values.
Yes.
So now that's one thing that came out of the post-Trump era, is that people who aren't on the far left or on the far right, everybody in the middle shares liberal values.
Yes.
And that's something we didn't realize was so valuable until it got threatened by people on the far right and the far left. But since Trump, I think the threat is greater from the far left than it is from the far right, because nobody takes the far right seriously. Nobody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would never want to say they're equally dangerous, but my worry is they could be in the future.
Yeah, that could happen. Yeah, who knows how it'll
Because
unfold.
I mean, my impression of the way things were going was there was a kind of backlash against the progressive left in the mid-teens. When Trump got in, everybody went hysterical about Trump. And the backlash against that hysteria, it was still a lot of disaffected left-wing people, centrists, moderate right-wing people. There was this thing called the dark web on the internet, where people of all political, stripes who were moderate were defending liberalism and free speech. And now after Biden, it seems like that kind of, everybody who's sane against the left is kind of gone now. What we have now is basically a classical left versus right battle. And if you're in that kind of middle, the way that we were, now you sort of are a bit homeless.
Yeah.
Do you feel that way?
Yeah, but I don't really think of myself. I mean, what is it called? I heard this phrase recently. Domicide?
Domicide.
Yeah, the death of your home.
Oh,
right? So,
yes, that's a good metaphor.
Yeah. What's his name? I don't know if he coined the term, but I've been listening to this really fantastic lecture series on YouTube by a fellow named John Vervaeke, Vervaeke at the University of Toronto. And the name of the whole series is Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. He's a philosopher and a cognitive scientist. This is just a brilliant series about a lot of stuff, going all the way back to the axial age and why we have a meaning crisis now, and what we might be able to do to try to resolve it and everything. But he used that phrase domicide when he was talking about the fall of the Roman Empire and the absence of this structure of meaning, right? How meaning and mythos, religion gives you some kind of home that you can bring with you, wherever you are or whatever. And so so what you're talking about is a kind of domicide. But I never really, all my life, I've had maybe been so much experiencing one form of domicide after another that I'm relatively immune to it. Like my growing up, I wasn't in my own home in the projects. I was an enemy of the people. You know what I mean? It was like I was a refugee in my own, what should have been my home. And then when I moved to Brooklyn, I moved into an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood where nobody paid attention to me. I was marginalized. My next door neighbors, be playing ball. I tried to, they wouldn't socialize with me because I wasn't an Orthodox Jew. And they didn't say it, but it was obvious.
Right.
They wouldn't even speak to me. If their ball came into my yard, I would throw it back. They wouldn't even say thank you. There was this kind of thing. And then we moved to Bensonhurst, which at the time was an all-immigrant Italian neighborhood. And even though I have Italian ancestry and I learned some Italian in high school, I was not one of them. So I've never been at home anywhere.
Right.
In philosophy, I'm like a mystic, not, even though I do philosophy quite well, like every single place in my life that I've ever been, I've never really had the comfort of being a member of the group.
Right.
So even now that, yes, I sense this thing that you're saying, that like, yeah, the intellectual dark web is kind of quiet now.
Well, it's just the right. It's not the dark web anymore.
Yeah.
It's the dark web in name only, but it's basically Fox News.
Yeah, Tucker Carlson.
And not that I disagree with everything on Fox News. That's not the issue. There's
Right.
nothing attempting to be kind of syncretic and nuanced as a response to this rampant illiberalism. It's all either you're with us here or you're with us there, but nothing in the middle.
Yeah, I was cultivating the hope that maybe the opposite of domicide, domophilia, that the middle and the center, after all the polarization, would become a really powerful vocal force in our culture, and maybe really come into prominence, and maybe even change everything and take over and just eliminate the extremists on both sides. So that's very disappointing to see that it doesn't look like that's happening.
Yeah, and also I find the center, unfortunately, harbingers of the extremism that I don't like. The center is sort of like soft economics plus identity politics. That's no center, that's extremism as far as I'm concerned.
Well, why do you characterize the center as both of those things?
Well, the center is like Hillary Clinton. And to me, that was a form of extremism.
Yeah, I held my nose and I did vote for Hillary. I was a Bernie or bust guy. Speaking of being a lefty,
I was too. I was a Bernie or bust guy as well.
Yeah.
We both changed, I suspect.
Yeah, I was so angry at the Democratic Party for the way they treated him at the DNC. Oh my God. But then I was like, okay, I can't vote for Trump. I guess I'll have to vote for Hillary. I can't stand Hillary. But I did. I voted for Hillary, and I was devastated. I was up all night watching the results coming in. When Trump won, I was like, oh my God. Talk about shock. I couldn't believe it. But after things kept changing, I was like, well, you know what? I don't know what's the worst thing here.
Well, the experience I had was I didn't like Hillary at all, but I was sort of just supporting her because I thought Trump was a psychotic. And I thought anything better than a psychotic. But then when election night happened and I was watching it from England and Trump kept winning, I had this weird feeling of relief. I was like, why am I feeling relieved? This is scary. And it took me a while to process it. I think on some level I was relieved because I thought Hillary was going to start a confrontation with Russia. And Trump was right when he said she would have caused World War III. And to this day, I still think that his foreign policy might have saved the world. I can't prove that, but I have an intuition that something along those lines is true.
It makes some sense. Yeah, I thought his foreign policy was pretty good also.
I mean, the thing about Trump retrospectively is he's really difficult to explain and to have an opinion about for me. Because on the one hand, a lot of the things he did I didn't like. I didn't think the travel ban against Muslims was good. I thought the stuff about building the wall was fanning stupid flames and making ridiculous symbolic gestures. That was quite like the inverse of the left. But most of what he did outside of that politically seemed like it was superior to what his opponents would have done. And a couple of things he did were potentially civilization saving. But despite that, he behaved in the most atrocious, unstatesmanlike manner possible and made, I don't want to say made, but he created the conditions in which people would go mad and see him as a fascist. And he almost did it deliberately as a high five to his fan base. Like going, I'm not really a fascist, but I'm going to make myself look and sound like one to piss off these other people, to show how much I love you. And that is partly why the political polarization got so extreme. What do you think?
That's not an unreasonable view. I haven't thought about it as deeply as you have. It's hard for me to think clearly about Trump for the reason that you said, he's all over the place. But I think everything that you said is reasonable. Especially the stuff about the foreign policy. Yeah, and his behavior, his antics and everything, those were probably best interpreted, maybe even charitably interpreted, as just, kind of riling up his fan base.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, it's difficult because of the time when people would refer me to his behavior, I'd be like, okay, I agree that's bad, but the politics on the other side are worse and he's fighting them. Right. So don't worry about the behavior. Right. But now I kind of think, well, that behavior was really bad because it made it understandable that all those other people were so crazy in their opposition to him because he made himself look scary. And that's not what you want in a president.
It's a legitimate criticism of Trump. I found myself doing the same thing, which was saying that the fact that he was fighting things like critical race theory, and even if, the border was a little excessive or whatever, that most of the things that he was trying to do were things that I thought favored my political values and my political landscape against the threats to it coming from the far left and from wherever else. And so I found myself constantly being accused of liking Trump, which I did not. I never liked Trump. I thought his behavior was, moronic at times, really foolish, like just not well thought. Like, I don't know if he was some kind of Machiavellian genius or an idiot or some combination,
Does he seem like a quintessential New Yorker to you? Because a lot of people in England were sort of saying things to the effect of, no, don't take him too seriously. This is just New York. This is what New Yorkers are like. Do you think that's accurate?
It might be accurate. I don't want to generalize about New Yorkers because New Yorkers have people like, David Dinkins and, who would Bloomberg or what, all these different characters, so, and what's the present guy's name? De Blasio, and, so they're not all in the same league. They're all New Yorkers,
Of course, but I mean, I suppose the question is the sort of behavior that you saw from Trump on the podium, that sort of aggressive, defensive, you come at me, I'm going to come at you harder thing, is that a very New York attitude in your experience, or is that just a sociopathic attitude?
Yeah, well, like how you said, if anybody comes at you on social media, you give it right back to them, right? So there's an element of that in Trump, right? Like, I'm not going to stand down. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not going to be straitjacketed by political correctness and all that. So like blue collar people and all sorts of people who allegedly have white privilege, but who don't have any privilege at all, and who maybe were being, mischaracterized and burdened by all these cultural accusations, and they saw somebody like him as a kind of a mascot for their little, they don't have a voice, right? So like, I've heard this kind of talk from people who I know, and like friends and relatives, who's an engineer, who's a construction worker, like they all love Trump. Why? Because they've been feeling the encroachment of these ideologies, right? And being displaced and whatever, and being looked at like they have privileges that they don't have. And so they just love Trump because he just touts all that,
Yeah.
And that's a New York blue collar attitude, or lower, lower class, lower middle class, working class. That's a working class New York attitude. So in that regard, Yeah, it's a working class New York attitude, but not just New York. I think all over the United States, it's a working class kind of attitude. But working class New Yorkers are particularly vocal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's certainly understandable that he would be appealing because he was standing up to totalitarians and saying, you can't bully me, fuck you. It's
Right.
totally understandable that New Yorkers, working class people, conservatives, anyone who didn't like PC would be resonating on some level with that.
Exactly.
But the problem is, by saying fuck you to them, he wasn't just saying fuck you to them, he was kind of saying fuck you to the entire establishment, fuck you to everything that isn't me. And that looked scary to all sorts of different people, even people who didn't like political correctness too.
Yeah.
The double-edged sword.
Yeah. Yeah, look, he definitely, like, if he didn't go as far as he did with a lot of this behavior, he probably would have been reelected.
I totally agree. He could be remembered as a good president, or maybe even a great one.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, he shot himself in the foot repeatedly with, his own stupid behavior. But because, in terms of foreign policy, if he didn't develop this horrible basis for ad hominems against him, right, there would be almost nothing to criticize him about,
Yeah. I mean, if you imagine somebody like Obama doing most of what Trump did,
oh, forget
that
about
would
it.
be remembered as a great president.
It'd be statues of Obama already while he was still alive.
Yeah. So for me, it was, do you value the politics more or the personality tactics more? And what the whole Trump phenomenon made me realize was, I thought politics are more important. Now I'm not so sure, because you can have the right politics, but if you behave badly, you can cause a civil war. If you're hyperbolic and vitriolic enough towards your opponents, you can cause really horrible shit in your country. And it seemed like he was on the verge of doing that. Like, if he had been elected again and kept behaving that way, you could have had a civil war.
Yeah, but I'm not so sure about the extent to which we could attribute all of that to him, as if he's in a vacuum, because the media did crucify him on a daily basis. And the media, like, I would assign more guilt to that potential civil war to the media and to other politicians and to his enemies and, to all of our friends, those people that we argued with on social media, like, this was just a massive, almost like a religious movement, the I hate Trump movement.
I know.
And they treated him that way before he did hardly anything to justify that treatment.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the hallmarks of arguments that I'm initially skeptical of, because it seems like there's something psychologically wrong with the arguer, is when, to convince you that someone's bad, they give you 75 arguments or 75 reasons.
Yeah.
Because if someone is really bad, you don't need 75 reasons. All you need is 2 or 3.
Right.
So when they give you 75 arguments as to, here's 75 laws he broke, or here's 150 lies he told, you can tell the mind is just looking for reasons to justify what it's already decided. This is coming from a place of bad faith. Because if he really is bad, you don't need that many arguments.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I remember when he was running, and like I said, I was shocked that he won and very, very disappointed. But I remember, like, the video or audio of him coming off that bus and making remarks about you could just grab women by the whatever, and like
In
all those
2006.
yeah, that these things that were coming out. I remember thinking, oh, he's, what kind of guy is that? I didn't know they still had guys like that. This is from
Sounds like my dad.
Yeah, so I'm saying, it sounds like from my father's generation. He's not that much older than me. But in a way, and like, I'm never really, I was never ever really defending Trump. But the truth of the matter is, like, some people talk like that when it's locker room type talk, right? So, like, if it's your friend or somebody you like or who you know is a decent person, and this, something like that happened, you go, well, he was just joking around or whatever, or he was bragging, or he was trying to act like he has more power than he had.
I just thought it's obviously hyperbole, because if he spoke to somebody seriously and said, I grab women by the pussy, I'm a serial sexual assaulter,
Right.
they'd call the police.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Right. So I don't know if you ever read the book by Harry Frankfurt on bullshit. Yeah.
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So Trump was bullshitting. He was bullshitting when he did that. And this is what men from his era do when they're hanging out in bars or with the boys, or when guys start, from that little social milieu, they start bullshitting each other. Then bullshit is the norm, right? And it's almost like an ego contest. Who could bullshit the other one better or whatever. I've been in those, I worked in blue collar jobs in between high school and college, even throughout high school. I've been all kinds of blue collar jobs. The way that those people talk and act and everything, that at least back then, that was normal behavior, right? In certain milieu. So I've been in so many different walks of life that I'm capable of seeing things from multiple perspectives, A and B, because like I even said earlier, you can't know if somebody's, what their motives are or what their mindset. Is it intentional use of fallacy? Is it sophistry? Is it unconscious? Whatever. When you don't know, it's epistemically incorrect to attribute motives unless you've got really good evidence, right? So similarly, how serious and literal somebody means something when they could be in a bullshitting context, it's I'm always like that. So whenever there's anything on the news too about, O.J. Simpson or, George Floyd or whatever the case is, right? I'm always I gotta wait until I hear a lot more evidence. Just seeing the little video snippet of something has never been enough for me, because I can imagine all kinds of contexts that happened before that. And that's all you have. And what do we call this? The fallacy of decontextualization. If you pluck out a bit of something and take it out of its context and present it like that, it's well, either of us might have said something in this podcast, about Hitler or whatever it was. You just take that one sentence and put it out there, and we're going to they can cancel us, because they've contextualized us. So, but with Trump, I liked his politics. I liked the fact that he was fighting for values that I like and that I thought are being threatened by the far left. And so I favored him, but not him, the person, him president in the role that he was in, doing the things that he was doing, not his personal stupidity, right? But I kept finding incapable of explaining that to people who would constantly say, you say anything that tries to put whatever he does in perspective and say, well, yes, he doesn't have Obama's class. He's not articulate. He's stupid. He's this, he's that, he's the other thing, right? But I like that he's doing this, right? Or I like that he did that in the Middle East or whatever it is, right? The I hate Trump folks, you can't make those distinctions with most of them.
It's really hard to convince people that the villain is the anti-hero. You have a much better chance convincing them the villain is the hero. But with him, it was, no, the villain is the anti-hero. He's an asshole. He's a piece of shit, but he's better than the other people.
Right. Yeah.
But even I started to question that after the election results, when I started seeing people at the Capitol. Because, I do think there's hyperbole and double standards about what happened then and all the other activism that was done by the left in 2020, the violence and so on. But that particular event and his reaction to it did kind of scare me, because I was thinking, what if he won't go? What's going to happen then? Not like I was worried about what was going to happen to Washington, but I was worried, if he doesn't go, what's going to happen in all the other cities? Were you worried about that?
Yeah. Until the outcome was resolved, I think everybody was worried about, on both sides. Like, this could get really hairy, depends. He's been significantly irrational on numerous occasions. So, this could be a powder keg that he ignites, but with all the momentum of the protests in 2020, and then this issue of him not wanting to cede power to Biden, people storming the Capitol and all this, it looked like who knows what could happen in the next months. I'm just happy that it ended the way that it did. I mean,
yeah. So are you happy with the Biden administration that has taken his place, or are you unhappy with it?
Well, I'm unhappy with it because right off the bat, Afghanistan, critical race theory, right? Like was it day one when Biden overturned Trump's executive order about not funding critical race theory in federal programs?
Oh, he tried to overturn almost everything Trump did.
Yeah, but like that's one of the things that really bothers me, the CRT thing, because to me that's racism. And like I said, I grew up in racism as a victim of racism, and I believe that there is such a thing as non-white people being racists, which is something that, according to the new ideology, I'm not even entitled to think. I battled with people about that, but Robin DiAngelo, and like she became a multimillionaire overnight. The White Fragility book of hers is being advised by all the intelligentsia and the cognoscenti on the college campuses that we should all be reading that. And
yeah, that book hasn't taken on in England. That book is viewed here with a bit of skepticism.
Well, England doesn't have the same history as the United States does. It doesn't have, ironically, though, it was like a global hegemonic white power.
That's true, but we ended slavery earlier. So
right. Yeah, so it might be a peculiarly American vulnerability to white guilt or whatever. But
well, do you think I don't know. Do you think the Biden administration is making it easier to fight these things because you don't have Trump as a kind of a bogeyman, or is it harder?
Oh, yeah, maybe it is easier. I'm not sure, because like it's a kind of double-edged sword thing. Like on the one hand, it's being allowed to infiltrate academia, even K to 12, kindergarten to 12th grade. I don't know if the systems are the same over there in the UK, but you are an American, so you remember what that stands for. But
yeah, I'm both technically, but go on.
Yeah, that really troubles me. That like these kinds of it's like the Red Brigade or something. It's like the Cultural Revolution in China is happening right here in the United States.
No, I agree. It is evil.
And that terrifies me, and they're in favor of it, and they verbally advocate it, and they talk about it all the time, and they promote, it's just like that little thing I said, it got slipped in on that show, the chair, right? That CRT is important or whatever, right? But so there's that, and then like just this massive blunder in Afghanistan. I think I heard, I don't know if it's true, that I heard it on a talk radio show. So I don't know if it's true. It wasn't really news that I read. I only heard this when I was driving yesterday or the day before, that China already purchased, what was the name of that airfield that we lost in Afghanistan? Bagram or something like that?
I don't know the name of it, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, like China bought it already. And it's going to become a Chinese military installation. That was our closest base to China, and now it's China's base, aimed in our direction. Like just the billions of dollars worth of equipment. Not only that, the economic loss of all of that, but now all that technology and the knowledge of it, intellectual property, that like all the military secrets that were built into that equipment, China has it all now.
Yeah,
that worries me. That's just one little example. But yeah, maybe because we don't have somebody that the left can constantly rip apart on a daily basis and associate everything with Trump, Trump, Trump. So one way of getting, like, just opposing any idea that I might like was easy for the left by just saying, Trump said it, right? End of story. Well, they can't do that now. So maybe that does at least open up the possibility of trying to, turn the dial back on a lot of these other policies and whatnot. I don't know. What do you think about it?
Well, my suspicions about it are similar to yours. I don't like a lot of, probably most of what the Democratic Party wants to do. Although I wouldn't say I'm a Republican either. This is difficult. I probably disagree and agree equally with both parties in their pure form. I'm probably a kind of centrist. But one party is in the grip of evil, and the other party is in the grip of things that are narrow-minded and cruel. So I'll go with narrow-minded and cruel provisionally, but in the long run, I don't want to side with narrow-minded and cruel.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's very frustrating. I remember when I was an undergrad at Brooklyn College, I was the president of the Student Philosophy Club, which is still running ever since I created it. So I'm happy about that.
That's awesome.
Philosophy Society. We had a Christmas party and we brought in all kinds of food and whatnot. And I remember just hearing a conversation. One of the faculty members was asking one of my friends at the time, I'll just leave his name out of it. I only overheard the snippet of this. Well, no, what if I said to you, this is the faculty member, philosophy professor, what if I said to you, you have to pick one party or the other? You're either a Democrat or a Republican. You can't be in the middle. You have to pick one or the other. And he said, in response, the student said, I'd say you were an asshole.
Yeah, I would maybe agree with that in like 2007 or 8.
Yeah, nowadays you have to vote. You have to vote for the less.
Now I would vote anything to get out the liberals, even though I'd be giving my vote to people who disagree with me on a massive amount of things, which is very sad to me.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have a two-party system virtually, even though we allow the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, independents, whatever. It's basically Democrats or Republicans.
It is, and it's not going to change. In fact, one of the things I regret most politically is giving my vote to Ralph Nader in 2000. I will never vote for a third party ever again. But, like the political spectrum has changed so much since 2014 as it is, that a lot of things that used to be left-wing are considered right-wing anyway, like being skeptical of globalization. That was very much a left-wing thing in the 90s when I grew up. Now it's considered a right-wing thing.
Yeah.
A lot of what Trump did in that regard was stuff that you would think in theory college kids protesting my age would be loving as adults, but no, they were on board with the globalization train and the European Union and all of this internationalist stuff that even 15 years earlier they were totally against.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which like left and right are not stable enough for me to even say I have an allegiance to one or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a lefty my whole life. My father was a Democrat, union delegate, so all that kind of ideology, I grew up with it. And after Trump got elected, I moved toward Trump. So
did I.
Yeah. So after my devastation that he won, right, it was only a short period of time when I started seeing, the insanity on the far left. Like one of my colleagues, who I was never particularly friendly with, but really nice guy, business professor, conservative, always wears a suit, a little older than me. Some of the progressive faculty members after Trump, like they were all insane. There was a kind of, what is that called? Trump derangement syndrome?
Yeah.
TDS.
That hit my whole family.
Yeah, they were going off the rails And like, so one of the things, because Trump, wanted to close the border and all this, so they wanted to do this thing about make the college a sanctuary college. Sanctuary, yeah. They petitions and all this. They started becoming super activists, right? The far left. They just woke up from, being in some kind of bourgeois happy state to becoming political activists because Trump got elected. And so they started doing this and that and that. And they also started going after conservative faculty members. So like I said, there was this one guy, nice fellow, but on his Facebook wall, he would post occasionally memes that, American flag, he was a Trump voter. That was almost as if just the fact that he favored Trump proved that he was some kind of enemy of academia. Some of my colleagues who were on the far left, they were going around, they started some kind of informal whispering campaign that started to grow and snowball. And then when one of them approached me about it, I said, look, I know I have uncles or godfather or whatever, I know nice people that I used to work with, like, who are reasonable human beings who like Trump for not because they're racist or they're this or they're that, but because they thought he's going to bring back jobs or whatever. Like, they like the narrative and they voted for him. That doesn't mean that you're a bigot just because you voted. I'd be arguing with them and they go, oh no, he's a bigot. And look, they would show me, have you seen his Facebook wall? Get up on the phone and show me. He had a meme on his wall. What was it? It was like, these, what's that Willy Wonka meme where they'll be
everywhere.
Yeah. So there'll be like one picture on top of somebody saying something, and then Willy Wonka's funny reply on the bottom half, right? And like on the top half, there was a woman with a Muslim headdress on, and she had up some kind of sign criticizing, the United States for something, for the border or whatever it was, right? And then Willy Wonka's reply was something like, funny from somebody coming from a country or an area of the world where women have no rights or whatever it was, right?
Yeah.
And that was it. And that alone, plus a picture of Trump or something, that was considered proof by my colleagues that this guy was a racist bigot who should be fired. And they went around and tried to do that. They tried to get him fired. They were putting up posters on campus and whatever. It was just ridiculous. There was vandalistic graffiti outside of his office door. He was Jewish, so they, swastikas and all this kind of stuff. And I couldn't even reason with them about this. Like, they were convinced that, no, he's a Trump guy, as if it follows logically from the fact that anyone who voted for Trump or could even have something funny with a Muslim woman in it is automatically Islamophobic, racist, fascist, right? And they try to get him fired. That was the first part of my red pilling experience when I saw that going on. I mean, I'm not a right winger, but I moved away. The far left moved away from me very close to home when they started engaging in those activities.
Yeah, me too.
No reasoning with these people. Like,
no, they're motivated by things that they seem unaware of, and the politics seem less like politics than like religious rituals.
Religious, yeah. That's what James Lindsay says. I don't know if you followed any of his work.
Yeah, no, he's quite interesting. I'd like to have him on the podcast too.
I had him on my podcast. I know him if you don't have a connection with him.
Oh, that would be great. I'd love to have him on. He's a hero of mine.
Yeah, he was one of my heroes too. So we loved having him on. If you didn't see it, I'll send you the link to it.
Okay. So I suppose what I want to end this with is, you're a Buddhism scholar. How does all of this fierce political commitment to fighting for justice square with, or is maybe enhanced by, your Buddhist thinking? Or is it totally separate?
Well, are you asking me about my own intellectual life as somebody who's following politics and being courageous by speaking my voice and all that, like my own personal little world of activism. Who are you asking about? Are you asking about how does Buddhism
Okay, I'll make it clearer.
consistent with
I'll make it
activism?
clear. I'm an idiot. And the way that an idiot like myself would think about this issue is Buddhists are supposed to be peace-like and nonviolent, and they don't get caught up in worldly affairs.
Oh,
And look at you getting caught up in worldly affairs and fighting for justice. How is this consistent?
okay.
So how do you answer the idiot's question?
Oh, so that's a good question. Okay, so it's multiply nuanced. So first, I'll remind you that I'm not really a Buddhist. One of my areas of scholarly interest is Buddhism. So that's number one. But I've admitted that, I like Buddhism philosophically, just like I like Randianism, even though those two things are probably very inconsistent with each other, because, as you know, Rand is all about self and self-interest, right? And Buddhism, by and large, although there's disputes among Buddhists about this, but the larger consensus among Buddhists is that there's no such thing as a self. So there's that. But like, those are just two people. I mean, I love Aristotle, I love Wittgenstein, but there's lots of things about these people that I disagree with, or their philosophies rather. But what's the relationship? In my case, I don't know. It's a really good question. Like, I disagree with the Buddhists about no self. That's number one. So that's something that I write about. I argue with them. I take a rare, unique minority position. That's why I'm not even at home with the Buddhists, because their allegedly core insight is that there's no self. And when you realize that, you're enlightened, right? And so I kind of disagree with that. I think there's ways in which that's partly true, but ways in which it's not. And so I'm like a voice in that wilderness out there saying, no, actually, you know what? Like, one of the primary premises of my last book, my monograph on Buddhism and free will, was that meditation enhances your agency, right? Like, because, let me give you a simple example, Frankfurt, right? So a wonton for Frankfurt is somebody who only acts on their wanton, desires that come, impulses, right? Remember that distinction?
Yeah.
So in Buddhism, what makes you a non-wanton right off the bat is meditation enables you to step back from your desires instead of just identifying with them and acting on them, and look at them, which is immediately a second order perspective, as Frankfurt would call it.
Right.
Right. So, and then when you're reflecting on your own intentions as a Buddhist, you are valuing them as leading towards or away from enlightenment. They're skillful or unskillful, right? So you're cultivating a hierarchical will, Frankfurt would say, right? You have higher order approval or disapproval of your base desires. And so you're cultivating some kind of hierarchical structure, which is an agency structure, right? And the more you do that, the more you have an ability to identify with or disidentify with your own motivations and alter them, and have the kind of will that you want to have. Frankfurt would say, if you have the kind of will you want to have, you have more free will than someone who's just like a wonton, has almost no free will, right? So the Buddhist meditation thing, to my thinking, the more you do that, the more you're able to even do that at the highest metacognitive levels about your own thoughts and beliefs and emotions and everything else. You cultivate a greater autonomy, which is mental autonomy or mental freedom, right? And like the Buddha claimed, for instance, I'm able to think any thought I want to think and not think any thought I don't want to think. I'm able to have any resolve, which is a kind of second order intention, right? I resolved. I'm able to have or not have any resolve I want to have or not have, respectively, right? He's able to have or not have any emotion. This is a broader kind of autonomy that includes what Frankfurt would call free will as just one kind of subcomponent, or it's kind of meta level free will, right? And I think that that's legitimate. Like, of course, there are aspects of what it means to be a person that are processual, but then there's also this structural thing, right? Which is like your habits and everything. What you cultivate, Aristotle would say, the more you do something, the more you cultivate a habit. So you create your own character. So you have like freedom of the self too. The more you practice meditation, you create the kind of self that you want to have. So you've got all these higher level agent-like abilities, which to me are all increases in free will and autonomy, right? So for those reasons, and the metaphysics of it is complicated, so I don't want to go too far into that. But that's what I write about for the most part. But so I believe that even though a lot of the Buddhist path is filled with all this kind of sapiential, procedural, knowledge and skill-based content, right? There's a lot of great cognitive toolkit there, which I love, all of that. I disagree with the ideology a little bit about there being no self or, all that other mythological stuff. So to me, meditation practice has given me a stronger ego, but not a narcissistic ego, because I'm also, the more you practice meditation over decades, the more you see the kind of impersonal way in which the process of just kind of being a self evolves, and it's interdependent with all these other causes and factors, many of which are beyond your control. And so what I say is like, the more that you evolve along the meditative path as a Buddhist, the greater that your self and your autonomy become, but simultaneously, inversely, the less you identify with yourself as me, right? You're not kind of imprisoned in your own self-concept. It becomes almost like, and I would imagine that at the peak of enlightenment, it's something like agentless, but maximal agency. Like you have the maximal abilities as an agent, although you don't identify with your agency the way that you did prior to you attaining that level. So I have this very unique view about Buddhism, but that's consistent with being a very strong agent and caring about things in the world. Now, there's a big criticism nowadays that you might have heard just once I mentioned the word, if you've heard about it, you'll know the whole narrative with it. It's McMindfulness. Have you ever heard that phrase?
Yes, mental health is getting quite a beating here amongst the intelligentsia.
Okay, so McMindfulness, I happen to know one of the two people very personally who coined that term, and the other person, I'm affiliated with him through scholarship and everything, but I don't know him that well personally. Ron Purser and David Loy, they came out with this article about McMindfulness in the Huffington Post back around almost 10 years ago. I forget what exact year it was.
It took a beating in 2012. There were a lot of articles along those lines in like Guardian.
I think around 2012. Yeah, he started it. Those two started it, and then it became like a cottage industry, an easy. I hate to be so critical, but an easy way for people to get published, to just jump on a bandwagon that has social value at the time. It's a hot issue, so it's going to get published. But that's not really fair, because a lot of them, I think, genuinely believe the critique that they're leveling. Zizek made the same. Slavoj Zizek. He made the same criticism that mindfulness, has become the new opiate of the consumerist masses.
It does nothing to change anything. And, Steve and, what does he say? Sting and Bill Gates can adhere to all of that ideology and still be Bill Gates and Sting.
Yes, exactly. Right. So that's the criticism, just like, the McDonaldization of globalization, right? American jeans and pop music and sneakers and all the, around the globe, and, McDonald's in India and all this kind. So the McDonaldization of consumerist global capitalism, right, is taking over the globe. And what fits perfectly with that as almost like a new religion? Mindfulness. So what is mindfulness? How does mindfulness fit in? Well, that Vervaeke guy, he's going to say, well, it helps solve the meaning crisis thing. It's a kind of like a religion without a religion. And we need something like that has almost a mythos about it and whatever, and it empowers people. But the critics say, no, that's not it. This is a way to generate a whole generation of better milk producing cows. Workers of the world won't unite because what they're doing is sublimating the stresses created by the man and by the capitalist society. They're internalizing them and dealing with them only as individualized stress that I need to resolve on my meditation cushion. So it's kind of depoliticizing all the victims of global capitalism who should be socialists, right? I mean, that's really what the critique is. It's a very strong socialist critique of Buddhism, that it's depoliticizing all the potential activists at a time when they should be out there marching and changing this horrible society that we're in, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of attack on agency, but whereas I think, no, it's up to individuals like that. That's looking at people as if they don't have agency. Like you said, no matter whether you're in the Taliban, you still have agency, right? So this treats people who are in this critique as if they don't have minds of their own, as if they don't have agency of their own, as if they're so stupid that they just go into the watering hole of meditation to quiet up all their stresses from living as victims of capitalism, and they don't know any better. And we have to rescue them from this because it's a global conspiracy, a global capitalist conspiracy. That's why all the big companies are now fostering meditation, healthcare system, education. It's a mindfulness. Okay, there's something legitimate about it. It might have that impact in many cases, but I believe in the agency of individuals. And I personally think that kind of practice is metacognitive and it fosters agency. B, one more thing. Having those skills cultivated, self-reflection, ability to concentrate, calm your mind, look at things from different perspectives, those are sapiential skills, wisdom cultivating skills, cognitive toolkit skills that will benefit anybody, whether you are a samurai, a priest, a baker, an activist. It doesn't matter what you are. Those are just generic human skills that you're developing. Mm-hmm. So it's like being against exercise or logic. It's a generic human skill. It's the opposite of mindlessness.
Well, what's interesting to me about the critique is in some ways it's like a critique of music. You could level all the same criticisms of music you would at mindfulness.
Yeah, or of sports. Sports is sublimating the aggression that you might take out on society, as you should, because you're a victim of these institutional practices that have, alienated you. You need to be a communist and get out there and revolt with the rest of the workers of the world and stop going to football games, concerts, movies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're all the same. And that, yeah.
Yeah, the worry I have about that kind of view is it seems to be presupposing a lot that it's not stating on the surface. One thing of which is that the only morally acceptable mode that a human being can be in is activist.
Right.
And insofar as there are any other modes, those modes are a threat to the morally acceptable mode.
And there's one even deeper than that presupposition on which that one rests, which is activists of a certain kind.
Yeah, you can't be a right-wing one. You have to be a left-wing one.
Right. You have to be a socialist critiquing global consumerist capitalism. That's it.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a socialist friend who I've interviewed on the podcast called Bradley Tuck. At least I think he's a leftist. Maybe socialist might be the wrong term. He can correct me if he wants to. But he said something very interesting in response to this critique, actually, of Zizek against mindfulness. He said that it undermines the idea that when you create a revolution, even a socialist revolution, you want the end goal to be a society in which people are allowed to have fun. Or else what was the point of the revolution? If the world you create is a world where nobody can have fun, you haven't created your utopia.
Yeah.
And I've always thought a very interesting leftist critique of that idea, that even the revolution needs fun. Fun meaning the life apart from politics.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the frightening things about the new orthodoxy.
Yeah.
There's no humor in it whatsoever.
No, you're only allowed to mock and deride and be scathing.
About one side. Like late night television in the United States, I don't know what it's like in the UK.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah. And I don't know what I don't watch, I stopped watching it, because it was just the same old nonsense. But I don't know if they have anything to talk about now that Trump's not the president. He gave them a free ride in terms of content for 4 years.
Yeah, they're probably struggling. I mean, in this country, everything you would think they would be talking about, like COVID controversy and so on, tends to take second banana to all the old 20 teens cultural issues like identity politics and environmentalism and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean,
yeah, that reminded me one other thing I wanted to say. I only mentioned like 2 reasons, like Afghanistan and CRT as my Biden, aversions. The other one was, oh my God, it's blanking here. Maybe this conversation is going on a long time.
it's all right.
Something that you just mentioned, I lost my train of thought. Well,
Something about Biden you didn't like.
Comedy, there's no comedy, late night TV, no more.
No,
Trump.
comedy is dead. I mean, this is a real difficulty I have because I really love films.
Oh, I'm sorry. I remember the Green New Deal.
Oh, the Green New Deal, yes.
Yes, the Green New Deal.
That existed before Biden. That was a Trump era thing, wasn't it?
It was a Trump era thing, but those people who were advocating it now have the support of the White House. And that's a little scary to me because that's a little bit like using a sledgehammer, to drive in a nail or something like that. I do believe that climate change is an important thing for humanity to address, but those particular solutions offered in the Green New Deal are a little drastic.
Well, that's a reflection of a discourse problem. We can't have nuanced talk about the environment ever.
Yeah, that's it.
Because people have accepted the most extreme interpretation of the science available.
Yeah.
Because that's gotten some vindication because a lot of expert bodies support that. But the actual science doesn't tell us that we need to deindustrialize or die.
Right.
It really doesn't.
Right. And this is just like every other issue, like my colleague going around saying, well, I can't work with Repetti, he's against equity. And then, the word coming back to me that I'm being depicted like Jordan Peterson, because I said, I've made equity hires myself. I'm not completely against it. It's about how it's implemented that matters to me. And not every mode of implementing that initiative is one that's necessarily morally correct. Same thing with the Green New Deal, but there's no nuance on any position other than the position taken by the far left.
Yeah, it's all, we either have an apocalypse or we deindustrialize, nothing in between. And there's no moral reason or justification for looking at all the scientific reasons why industrialization protects people from things like energy poverty and that kind of pollution. Not allowed to go there.
I know. And the fact that there's more forestation going on in the last, 20, 30 years than the deforestation that we lost in the last century, combined, which is a good thing.
There's a lot of really weird positions, like we have to conserve land. When people say, oh, we have to conserve this particular lake, you want to ask them, conserve them from what? Conserve this land from what? Well, some form of industrialization that would help people do stuff. You want the planet not to be used to help people to do stuff, because you're worried that the beauty of the planet is more important than our ability to use it to do stuff, especially if the doing stuff helps poor people. No, can't do that. Have to save the planet. The planet comes first.
Yeah.
And if you adopt the planet comes first attitude, humans aren't going to be on the planet for very long, because the planet without technology is horrible for humans.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with Steven Pinker on this.
Me too.
Yeah, 100%. And of course, they tried to cancel him just for making all those claims in that book.
Yeah. Well, what really irritates me is they always say things like, well, there is no cancel culture because he's not canceled. And you want to say, of course he's not canceled. He's Steven Pinker.
Right.
What about, the postgraduate student or the elementary school teacher who doesn't have his profile?
Yeah. Or even college professors like Eric Weinstein,
Yeah. It's so weird how society has gotten so good materially and simultaneously so psychologically unhealthy in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
But either way, thank you so much for being on my podcast, and thank you for talking to me about it. It was really fun.
Yeah, Greg, we've chit-chatted before digitally, and we've left voice recordings for each other on Messenger. That was almost like this. And this is not actually in person, but it's almost as good. Great to meet you. And thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'd love to do it again sometime if you're free.
Absolutely.
This is Greg Scorzo, and that was the Culture on the Offensive podcast. If you like this podcast, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you're interested in any of the other things that we do at Coda Publishing, check us out at www.cultureontheoffensive.com. At Culture on the Offensive, you can purchase my new book, Post-Socratic Dialogues Love, available from amazon.co.uk and amazon.com. You can also hear 3 chapters of that book for free in my play Love Before COVID, which you can hear at Culture on the Offensive, YouTube, Spotify, and several other audio platforms. So stay safe, be courageous, and don't forget to go outside of your comfort zone. And remember, when you hear things that sound wrong or silly or stupid or strange, don't forget to use empathy, clarity, and courage.